Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. This story belonged to my uncle. May he rest in peace. He served in the National Guard during the 70s and 80s, stationed primarily in the Pacific Northwest. I remember how he would tell us these incredible stories from his service tales that seemed too strange to be true. Yet the way he told them, with that distant look in his eyes, made us believe every word. Of all the stories he shared, this one left me with the most unsettling feeling for weeks after hearing it. It was one of those accounts that burrows into your mind and refuses to leave. My uncle told us about an incident that happened early in his career, when he was still green and eager to prove himself. He and his unit had been dispatched to assist in a search and rescue operation in the dense forests of the Cascade Mountains. A fellow serviceman had gone missing during a routine patrol and had been lost for 3 days. The initial search teams had come up empty-handed in that vast wilderness of Douglas firs and thick undergrowth. When my uncle's unit arrived at the staging area, they set up base in a small logging town at the forest's edge. The place had that end-of-the-world feeling, a handful of weathered buildings surrounded by towering trees that seemed to swallow the sky. While they were preparing their gear, an elderly local approached them near the general store. The man must have been in his 80s, with deep lines etched into his face and eyes that held the weight of too many secrets. He walked up to my uncle and a few other soldiers and said something that would haunt them for the rest of the mission. "You boys ain't gonna find that man. Not alive, anyway." When one of the soldiers pressed him for details, asking if he knew something about the missing person, the old man just shook his head slowly. "Y'all shouldn't go in there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left undisturbed." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into his cabin and not emerging again despite their attempts to question him further. Most of the unit laughed it off. "Crazy old coot," one of them said, but my uncle couldn't shake the man's words or the genuine fear he'd seen in those weathered eyes. From that moment, he felt something cold settle in his stomach, a premonition that this wouldn't be like any other search mission. They entered the forest in the late afternoon, when the canopy above began to filter the sunlight into an eerie green twilight. The Cascades were known for their beauty, but there was something different about this particular section of wilderness. The silence was too complete, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch, or the distant call of a bird that sounded more like a warning than a song. As they moved deeper into the forest, they began to notice something disturbing. Dead animals were scattered throughout the undergrowth, not just one or two, but dozens. Deer, rabbits, even a few bears, all in various stages of decay. There was no obvious cause of death, no signs of disease or predation. They just lay there as if they had simply decided to lie down and die. Night fell faster than expected under the thick canopy, and they switched to their flashlights and night vision equipment. Despite hours of searching, they found no trace of their missing comrade, no clothing, no equipment, no footprints. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Then, around midnight, one of the soldiers called out, In a small clearing about 50 yards from their position, he had found something partially buried under a pile of leaves. When they gathered around and carefully brushed away the debris, they discovered what appeared to be a human finger, severed cleanly at the knuckle. The discovery changed everything. Their commanding officer made the decision to continue the search through the night, despite the obvious dangers of navigating the forest in darkness. They had to know what had happened to their missing man. My uncle said that despite all his training, despite everything he had seen in his military service, he had never felt fear like that before. It wasn't the rational fear of enemy contact or natural hazards. It was something primal, something that reached deep into his bones and whispered that they were not alone in those woods. The old man's warnings echoed in his mind as they pressed deeper into the forest. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed magnified. He kept expecting something to leap out at them from the darkness, but the forest remained eerily quiet except for their own footsteps on the carpet of pine needles. Around 2 a.m, when the mist began to roll in thick between the trees, another soldier from a different unit, stationed on the perimeter, radioed in with an urgent message. Through the static and his obvious panic, they could make out that something was approaching their position from the north. A figure walking slowly through the fog. All units converged on the location, weapons ready, flashlights cutting through the mist. What they saw next would be burned into their memories forever. Emerging from the fog was indeed a figure, an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, wearing a tattered dress that might have been white once upon a time. She moved with an unnatural gait, almost gliding across the uneven forest floor. But it wasn't her appearance that froze them in place. In her gnarled hands, she carried what remained of a human head, unmistakably that of their missing soldier. And as she walked, she was methodically taking bites from it, her jaw working with a wet, grinding sound that carried clearly through the still night air. The sight was so grotesque, so utterly wrong, that several of the men nearly lost their composure entirely. Training kicked in, and weapons were raised, safeties clicked off. Their commanding officer shouted for the woman to stop, to drop what she was carrying and put her hands up. Instead, she looked up at them with eyes that reflected their flashlight beams like an animal's. Without warning, she hurled the remains of the head directly at them, the wet impact echoing through the trees. Then she turned and ran, not with the shuffling gait of an elderly woman, but with a speed that seemed impossible for someone her age. She moved like a deer fleeing a predator, crashing through underbrush that should have slowed her down, but didn't seem to affect her at all. They fired their weapons, the muzzle flashes lighting up the forest like lightning, but every shot missed. She seemed to anticipate each one, weaving between the trees with an inhuman grace until she disappeared completely into the darkness. They never found her. They searched for hours, expanding their perimeter until dawn broke through the canopy, but it was as if she had simply vanished. They never learned who she was, where she had come from, or why she had committed such a horrific act. The missing soldier's head and the finger they had found earlier were the only remains they ever recovered. When they returned to the logging town to report what had happened, they tried to speak with the old man who had warned them, but he refused to come out of his cabin. They could see him watching them through his window, but he wouldn't answer their knocks or respond to their calls. Without a warrant, they couldn't force entry, and their superiors were eager to close the case and move on. The official report listed the incident as an animal attack, though everyone involved knew that was far from the truth. My uncle never forgot that night in the Cascade Forest, and he never stopped wondering about the old man's warning. What had he known? Had he encountered that woman before? And most disturbing of all, was she still out there, somewhere in those dark woods, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into her domain? Years later, my uncle would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of her jaw working in the darkness, and the way her eyes had reflected their lights like something that had never been fully human at all. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My father spent 35 years in military service before his body finally told him it was time to retire. During all those decades, he experienced more paranormal encounters than any rational person should have to endure. As if the normal dangers of military life weren't enough, the violence, the trauma, the constant threat of death. He also had to contend with things that shouldn't exist according to everything we think we know about the world. This particular incident happened during the late 80s, when his unit was deployed to the remote mountains of Colorado, near the border with New Mexico. They had received intelligence about a large-scale marijuana cultivation operation hidden somewhere in the high country, run by a dangerous cartel that had been terrorizing the local communities. Their mission was to locate and eliminate the operation, while protecting the isolated ranch families scattered throughout the region. The terrain was brutal, jagged peaks that stretched up toward 13,000 feet, covered in dense forests of aspen and pine, with narrow valleys that seemed to swallow sound and light. Even in summer, the nights at that altitude were bone-chillingly cold, and in late October, when this story takes place, winter was already beginning to stake its claim on the high country. They had been camped for nearly a week on a rocky outcrop that gave them a commanding view of several valleys below. The location was strategic, but exposed, and the constant wind that whipped across the mountainside made every night feel like an endurance test. They worked in shifts. Half the unit would sleep, while the other half maintained watch, rotating every 4 hours to ensure everyone got some rest. On this particular night, my father was on watch duty with 3 other soldiers. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and a thick fog had rolled up from the valleys below, reducing visibility to just a few dozen yards in any direction. The moon was nearly full, but its light was diffused and eerie through the mist, creating strange shadows that seemed to shift and move with every gust of wind. My father was scanning the perimeter with his binoculars when he caught sight of something moving in the distance. At first, it appeared to be a horse. He could make out what looked like the hindquarters of a large animal moving quickly through the trees, about 200 yards down the slope. The sighting lasted only a few seconds before the creature disappeared behind a stand of aspens. What struck him as odd was the location. They were at nearly 11,000 feet elevation, well above the tree line in most places, and certainly not an area where you would expect to find horses. The nearest ranch was miles away and hundreds of feet lower in elevation. Wild horses weren't unheard of in Colorado, but not at this altitude and not in this weather. he alerted his fellow soldiers, and they all began scanning the area with their binoculars and night vision equipment. For several minutes, they saw nothing but swirling mist and the ghostly outlines of trees swaying in the wind. They were about to dismiss it as a case of tired eyes playing tricks when one of the other soldiers suddenly grabbed my father's arm. "Put down the binoculars," he whispered urgently. "Look with your naked eyes down there by that lightning-struck pine." My father lowered his binoculars and followed his comrade's pointing finger. What he saw made his blood run cold and confirmed that this was no ordinary night in the mountains. Standing motionless beside a dead tree, clearly visible despite the fog, was a figure that defied explanation. From the waist up, it appeared to be a man tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like dark clothing. But its eyes glowed with a deep red light that was visible even at their distance, like embers in the darkness. And from the waist down, where human legs should have been, were the powerful hindquarters and hooves of a horse. The creature stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, watching them watch it. My father could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears and the rapid breathing of his fellow soldiers. None of them spoke. They were all trying to process what they were seeing, their minds struggling to make sense of something that shouldn't exist. Then the thing began to move. It started walking toward their position with deliberate, measured steps. Each footfall created a distinct sound that carried clearly through the thin mountain air. The sharp click of hooves on stone mixed with the heavier thud of something much larger than any normal horse. The combination was deeply unsettling, like listening to two different creatures walking in perfect synchronization. "Halt!" called out their sergeant, his voice echoing across the mountainside. "Identify yourself or we will open fire." The creature stopped for a moment, its glowing red eyes fixed on their position. Then it resumed its approach, this time moving faster. The sound of its hooves changed from a measured walk to a determined trot, and my father could see its human torso swaying with each stride. The soldiers called out more warnings, but the thing showed no sign of slowing down. If anything, it seemed to be picking up speed, breaking into what could only be described as a gallop. The sound was horrifying, like thunder rolling across the mountainside, growing louder and closer with each passing second. "Open fire," the sergeant commanded. The night erupted in muzzle flashes as 4 automatic rifles opened up simultaneously. The sound of gunfire echoed and re-echoed off the canyon walls, creating a deafening cacophony that seemed to go on forever. Through the chaos, my father could see their tracers finding their target, bright streaks of light that clearly impacted the creature's body. But it didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. The thing continued its charge up the mountainside, moving faster than any horse my father had ever seen, much less something carrying the added weight of a human torso. The bullets seemed to pass right through it, or perhaps they simply had no effect on whatever this thing actually was. As it got closer, my father could make out more details that made his stomach turn. The human portion had the general shape of a man, but the proportions were all wrong, too tall, too broad, with arms that seemed to hang down past where its waist met the horse body. And those eyes weren't just glowing red. They seemed to be burning with an inner fire that pulsed with each stride. My father later told me that his legs were shaking so badly he could barely maintain his firing position. The rational part of his mind was screaming that this couldn't be happening, that there had to be some explanation. But the primitive part of his brain, the part that still remembered when humans were prey animals hiding from things in the dark, was convinced that he was about to die. When the creature was less than 50 yards away, something unexpected happened. Instead of continuing its charge directly toward them, it suddenly veered to the left, maintaining its incredible speed but changing direction. It crashed through a patch of scrub oak and disappeared into a ravine, the sound of its hooves fading quickly into the distance. The 4 soldiers stood in the sudden silence, their ears ringing from the gunfire, their hands still gripping their weapons. Nobody spoke for several minutes. They all knew they had just witnessed something that couldn't be explained by any conventional understanding of the world. Eventually, their sergeant broke the silence. What the hell was that thing? None of them had an answer. My father had grown up on stories of the Southwest tales of skinwalkers, wendigos, and other creatures from Native American folklore. Some of the older soldiers began to whisper about the devil himself, especially given the stories they had heard about the cartel members they were hunting. Word was that some of these criminals practiced dark rituals, making deals with malevolent forces in exchange for power and protection. Whether those stories were true or not, my father became convinced that night that there were things in those mountains that didn't belong to the natural world. The feeling of dread and hopelessness that had settled over their camp was almost tangible, as if the very air had become poisoned by whatever they had encountered. The next morning, their commanding officer made the decision to relocate the entire operation to a different area. Officially, it was described as a tactical adjustment based on new intelligence. Unofficially, my father suspected that their had also felt the wrongness that had settled over their position after the encounter. They never returned to that particular mountain, and my father never saw the creature again. But he never forgot that night, and the knowledge that their weapons, the tools they depended on to protect themselves and others, had been completely useless against whatever that thing actually was. Years later, when he finally retired and started talking more openly about his experiences, he would tell me that of all the dangers he had faced in his military career, enemy soldiers, drug cartels, natural disasters, nothing had ever made him feel as helpless and vulnerable as that red-eyed thing galloping up the mountainside, immune to their bullets and hungry for something they didn't want to imagine. I'm no longer active military, but I spent 15 years serving with the Border Patrol along the Arizona-Mexico frontier. During that time, I witnessed more human tragedy than anyone should have to see families separated by politics and desperation. People dying from thirst and exposure in pursuit of a better life. Children abandoned in the desert when their parents could no longer carry them. But of all the heartbreaking situations I encountered during my career, none affected me as profoundly as what happened during a routine patrol in the Sonoran Desert near Tucson. This was back in 2012, during one of the hottest summers on record, when temperatures regularly exceeded 115 degrees, and the desert claimed more lives than usual. Our unit had been tracking increased smuggling activity in a particularly remote section of the desert, about 40 miles northwest of the city. The area was notorious for being a corridor used by both drug runners and human traffickers. but it was also one of the most dangerous stretches of desert in North America. The terrain was brutal, endless miles of sand, rock, and scrub brush, with no shade and no water for as far as the eye could see. Intelligence suggested that a major crossing was planned for that week, so we had established observation posts and were conducting round-the-clock patrols in an effort to intercept the group before they got too deep into the desert. Our primary concern wasn't law enforcement, it was humanitarian. Too many people had died in that wasteland, and if we could intercept them early, we might be able to save lives even as we enforced immigration law. On this particular night, my partner Rodriguez and I were assigned to patrol the southern perimeter of our area of operations. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate without night vision equipment, but the temperature was still over 90 degrees, even though it was past midnight. The desert never truly cooled down during those summer months. It just went from unbearable to merely oppressive. We had been walking for about 2 hours, following what appeared to be a game trail that ran roughly parallel to an old mining road, when we saw a figure in the distance moving toward us. In that part of the desert, any human contact was significant, so we immediately became alert and began moving to intercept. As we got closer, we could see that it was a small woman, probably in her 60s, walking slowly across the sand. She was tiny, couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, and appeared to be struggling with each step. Even in the moonlight, we could see that she was dangerously dehydrated. Her skin looked almost translucent, and she moved with the unsteady gait of someone who was very close to collapse. We approached her carefully, hands near our weapons, but trying not to appear threatening. People in her condition could be unpredictable, and we had learned that sudden movements or aggressive postures often made bad situations worse. "Ma'am," Rodriguez called out in Spanish, "are you all right? Do you need water?" She looked up at us with eyes that seemed too large for her gaunt face. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, dry and cracked like the desert floor. "Please," she said, pointing with a trembling finger back toward the direction she had come from. "Help my son, please, he needs help." We looked in the direction she was pointing, but couldn't see anyone else in the immediate area. The desert stretched out endlessly under the moonlight, with no sign of another person anywhere within our line of sight. "Where is your son, ma'am?" I asked, offering her my water bottle. "How far back?" But when I turned to hand her the water, she was gone. Not walked away, not hidden behind a cactus, gone. Vanished as if she had never been there at all. Rodriguez and I looked at each other, then began scanning the area frantically with our flashlights. There was nowhere she could have gone that quickly, especially in her condition. The nearest cover was at least 50 yards away, and we would have seen her moving toward it. "Did you see which way she went?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with confusion and concern. I hadn't. One second she was there, the next she wasn't. It was as if the desert had simply swallowed her up. We continued in the direction she had pointed, hoping to find her son and maybe get some answers about what had just happened. After walking for about 10 minutes, we spotted something that made our hearts sink: 2 figures lying motionless on the sand near a cluster of barrel cacti. We ran to them, fearing the worst but hoping we might still be in time to help. The first person we reached was a young man, probably in his early 20s, who was barely conscious but still alive. He was severely dehydrated and suffering from heat exhaustion, but his vital signs were stable. Rodriguez immediately began administering first aid, while I checked the second figure. When I rolled the body over, I felt my blood turn to ice. It was the same woman who had just approached us asking for help, the same face, the same small stature, the same clothing. But this woman had been dead for hours. Her body was already cool to the touch despite the ambient temperature, and rigor mortis had begun to set in. I called Rodriguez over, and when he saw what I was looking at, his face went pale. We both knew it was impossible. The same woman couldn't have been talking to us just minutes earlier and also been lying dead in the desert for half the night. But there was no question it was her. We decided not to say anything to the young man about what we had seen. He was already traumatized enough, and we weren't sure how he would react to hearing that his mother's spirit had somehow guided us to him. Instead, we focused on getting him stabilized and calling for medical evacuation. As we worked, he began to recover enough to speak, and through his tears, he told us their story. He and his mother had been traveling for 4 days, trying to reach relatives in Phoenix. They had run out of water on the second day, and his mother had been getting weaker with each mile they walked. She had collapsed that afternoon and died in his arms just as the sun was setting. He had been lying next to her body ever since, too weak to continue and too heartbroken to leave her behind. He was convinced that he was going to die there beside her, and in his delirium, he had been saying goodbye to her and asking for her forgiveness for bringing her on such a dangerous journey. When we told him that we had been led to his location by someone who wanted us to help him, he looked at us with an expression I'll never forget, part gratitude, part sorrow, and part something else that I couldn't quite identify. He never asked for details about who had guided us to him, and we never offered them. The medical helicopter arrived about an hour later and transported him to a hospital in Tucson, where he made a full recovery. His mother's body was handled with all the dignity and respect we could manage under the circumstances. She was given a proper burial, and her son was eventually able to contact the relatives they had been trying to reach. I never saw either of them again, but I never forgot that night in the Sonoran Desert. In all my years patrolling that border, I had seen the worst of human nature, the cruelty, the exploitation, the casual disregard for human life that characterized so much of the illegal trafficking trade. But I had also seen the best of it, the love, the sacrifice, the determination of people willing to risk everything for their families. What I witnessed that night went beyond both categories. It was something that challenged everything I thought I understood about life, death, and the bonds between parent and child. Whether it was hallucination brought on by the heat and stress, or something more supernatural, I may never know for certain. What I do know is that a mother's love for her child didn't end with her death in that desert. Somehow, someway, she found the strength to continue protecting her son even after her body had given out. She led us to him when he needed us most, and in doing so, she saved his life. I tell this story not to convince anyone of anything in particular, but to honor the memory of a woman whose name I never learned, but whose devotion to her child transcended even death itself. In a place where so much tragedy occurs, where so many stories end badly, it was a reminder that love is sometimes stronger than any force we can understand or explain. My name is Marcus, and until recently, I served as a lieutenant in an elite military unit. What I'm about to tell you is something that still haunts my thoughts to this day. It was an event that defied all logic and continues to make me question everything I thought I knew about life and death. It all began on a sweltering summer day in 2019. My unit and I were stationed at an old motel on the outskirts of a small desert town in Nevada. Our objective was clear. We needed to raid a safe house being used by a major drug trafficking organization at dawn. We left in convoy formation toward our destination, all of us carrying the tension we always felt before operations, where a single bullet could mean we'd never return to our families. The highway was practically a straight line surrounded by desolate fields and the occasional abandoned structure. About halfway to our target, we passed a house situated in a very unusual location. So isolated that the mere fact someone might live there seemed to make no sense. It was a solitary structure, weathered by time, with peeling paint and a yard overgrown with weeds. What really caught our attention was movement behind one of the dirty, fogged windows on the ground floor. There stood a small girl, no more than 8 years old, with disheveled dark hair and a sickly pallor. Her hands were pounding against the glass while she screamed. Although the sound of our engine and the closed vehicle windows prevented us from hearing her, we didn't need to hear her to understand the desperation transmitted by her eyes. Her gestures were frantic, as if each passing second increased her anguish. Every fiber of her small body seemed to cry out for help. Her face pressed against the glass with such intensity that it left marks on the dirty surface. Her mouth moved rapidly, forming words we couldn't hear but could feel in our bones. Instinctively, my hand moved toward the radio to suggest that one of the convoy vehicles stop to investigate. But a firm look from my commander reminded me of our mission's priority. It was a heartbreaking decision. Every fiber of my being screamed for us to stop and help, but our orders were clear, and there was no margin for deviations. The child's image burned into my retinas as we drove past, her desperate silhouette growing smaller in our rearview mirrors. Hours later, after completing the raid without major incidents, we returned via the same route. The memory of the girl still burned in my mind. I couldn't get those eyes full of desperation out of my head. The way her small fists had beaten against the glass, the pure terror etched across her pale features. So I convinced the commander to make a stop at the house. We parked a short distance from the main entrance, our headlights illuminating the deteriorated facade of the house. The structure looked even more ominous in the darkness, shadows dancing across its weathered walls like phantoms. Before exiting the vehicle, we checked our equipment and weapons, prepared for any sign of hostility. In tight formation, we approached the house. We quickly surrounded the property, ensuring there were no external threats or signs of occupation by any armed group. Without detecting any movement, we grouped in front of the door. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant howl of desert wind through the surrounding scrubland. "Military police, open the door," I shouted, hoping that if anyone was inside, they would cooperate without the need for violence. The silence that followed was our only response, heavy and foreboding like the calm before a storm. After a brief exchange of glances with my team, I made the decision to enter by force. The dry crack of the door breaking echoed through the night air, and once inside, the atmosphere became increasingly heavy. With our flashlights, we began to check each room. The house was furnished with a few pieces of furniture in very poor condition, and the entire place was covered in dust that had settled like a burial shroud over everything. After an exhaustive review of the first floor, we began climbing the stairs to the second floor. It was then that the air began to change. A fetid, heavy smell began to penetrate our face masks, growing stronger with each step we climbed. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under our boots, as if the house itself were warning us away. Upon reaching the second floor, the origin of the stench became undeniably clear, and we all exchanged knowing looks. The smell of rotting death was overwhelming, a sweet, cloying odor that seemed to coat the inside of our nostrils and throat. We advanced slowly down the hallway, with the caution one has when you know you're about to find something terrible. The door to the first room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with my gloved tactical hand, and the scene that was revealed before our eyes was heartbreaking. There, scattered across the room's floor, were the bodies of several children. Among those small, fragile bodies was her, the girl from the window, as pale as when I saw her screaming from behind the glass. Although none of us were forensic experts, experience had taught us to recognize the unmistakable signs of prolonged death. These children had been dead for at least 3 weeks, maybe more. Decomposition had begun to mark their physical features, and the sight was something that would be burned into our memories forever. We stood in silence, processing the scene and the tragedy before us. But more than that, we were grappling with the impossible fact that a corpse had screamed to us for help just hours earlier. The girl's body lay in the exact position that suggested she had been trying to reach that very window we had seen her at. After finding the bodies and ensuring there was no one else inside the house, we exited to report the situation. When the FBI and the coroner's office arrived, we withdrew from the location, and I didn't know anything more about it for several days, perhaps a full week. Finally, I received news that the bodies had been identified and that families were being notified. The investigation revealed that the children had been kidnapped over the course of several months by a trafficking ring that had been using the isolated house as a holding location before transport. Something had gone wrong, whether internal conflict or law enforcement pressure, and the children had been abandoned to die. One day, my commander approached me with an unusual request. He explained that the parents of the girl we had seen in the window wanted to meet the person who found their daughter. Although it wasn't mandatory, the gesture could provide some closure to that tragedy. I decided to accept the meeting. Part of me needed to see that cycle closed, to find some meaning in the horror we had witnessed. The meeting was in a small, discreet location coordinated by the FBI. The girl's parents, a man and woman marked by grief, extended their hands to me with gratitude that left me speechless. Their faces bore the weight of months of uncertainty, of sleepless nights wondering what had happened to their little girl. "Thank you," the mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our daughter disappeared more than 5 months ago. The police stopped searching after the first month, but you found our little girl. Now we can say goodbye to her properly, give her the burial she deserves." The words of gratitude and the tears in their eyes made me understand the magnitude of our accidental discovery. But more than that, they made me confront the impossible nature of what we had experienced. How does one explain to grieving parents that their daughter's spirit had guided us to her body. Until that moment, I had always believed that ghosts appeared to frighten the living, if they existed at all. But after that experience, I know for certain that some spirits manifest for other reasons, like wanting their bodies to be found, so they can finally return to their families after suffering for so long. Sometimes, the dead don't rest until the living can find peace through closure. That little girl in the window wasn't trying to scare us. She was asking us to bring her home. My name is Nicholas, and for more than a decade, I served in the Army. What I'm about to relate occurred in the fall of 2018. We were deployed to a city in northern Montana for training exercises. Upon arrival, we were assigned lodging in an old hotel that was in terrible condition. From the very first night, everyone in the platoon began to feel an oppressive atmosphere in that place. The hotel's structure was ancient, with long corridors that made every footstep echo through the building like whispers from the past. The rooms seemed to have been unoccupied for a very long time, with dust covering every surface and an air of abandonment that seemed to seep into your bones. The first night, after a long day of maneuvers, we were all looking for a good rest, but it was quite the opposite. As soon as the lights went out, strange things began to happen. First, there was the temperature change. The room, which had been at a comfortable temperature, began to cool rapidly to the point where I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. The cold wasn't natural. It was the kind of bone-deep chill that comes from something beyond the physical world. I thought about getting up to check the window, making sure it was properly closed, but then the sounds began. They were soft knocks, as if someone were tapping on the door. But when I checked, there was no one on the other side. The hallway was empty, lit only by flickering fluorescent lights that cast dancing shadows on the faded wallpaper. I returned to bed, trying to convince myself it was just old pipes, or perhaps the wind rattling through the building's aging frame. But the sound didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to move, traveling along the walls like something searching, probing. Then came the whispers, barely audible at first, like a murmur carried on a breeze that shouldn't exist indoors. I was sharing the room with two of my companions, Ernest and Alexander. We had been assigned one of the rooms on the third floor. The room had a double bed and a single bed, typical military accommodations. But shortly after the whispers began, we started hearing light taps on the window. The tension increased when we saw shadows moving through the room, dark shapes that seemed to have substance, but cast no reflection in the mirror. It was then that the incident occurred that convinced us we were dealing with a supernatural phenomenon. While the room remained silent, except for the whispers, one of the beds began to shake violently. There was no doubt about it, the bed was moving on its own. The blankets were thrown to the floor, and the pillows flew through the air as if they were made of paper, caught in an invisible storm. The three of us were paralyzed, watching as chaos erupted throughout the room. Dresser drawers slid open and slammed shut in rapid succession. The bathroom door creaked open and closed repeatedly, each movement accompanied by the sound of rushing water from faucets that turned themselves on and off. The temperature dropped even further, and our breath came out in thick, visible puffs. Without making much of a scene, we left the room and noticed that along the hallway, doors were opening as other soldiers, some still half-dressed, emerged from their rooms. Their faces reflected confusion similar to ours, mixed with a fear that none of us wanted to acknowledge. Some even seemed like they wanted to laugh nervously, but the laughter died in their throats when they saw the genuine terror in each other's eyes. It wasn't difficult to see that something abnormal was occurring in almost the entire hotel. The building itself seemed alive with malevolent energy, as if the very walls were trying to expel us. When we gathered in the hallway, one of our companions, Marco, who was staying on the second floor, mentioned that he had seen blurry figures crossing his room just before the lights began to flicker without explanation. Another companion said that the curtains in his room had moved violently despite the window being closed. David, usually the most level-headed among us, described how his reflection in the bathroom mirror had seemed to move independently, turning to look at him with eyes that weren't his own. It was then that we decided to inform our superiors. We contacted both our commander and one of the instructors who were staying in the west wing of the hotel. Their response was frustratingly dismissive. They simply told us to return to sleep, and that those who preferred could choose to spend the rest of the night in the vehicles parked outside. Some did return to their rooms, either out of stubborn disbelief or exhaustion. The rest of us, the wiser ones perhaps, went to the vehicles. I spent the remainder of that night in the back of a Humvee, listening to the distant sounds coming from the hotel creaking, occasional shouts, and once, what sounded like someone screaming before being abruptly cut off. At 5:30 in the morning, while we were having breakfast in the hotel's dingy dining room, it was impossible to ignore talking about what happened the night before. One after another, my companions began to share additional details of what occurred during the night, things they hadn't mentioned in the moment, perhaps too shaken or embarrassed to speak of them immediately. Javier, who had been relatively quiet until that moment, related how he heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the ceiling of his room, as if someone were pacing back and forth just above him. But the strange thing was that his room was on the top floor of the hotel, so there was nothing above except the old rooftop. The footsteps had continued for hours, sometimes stopping directly above his bed, as if whatever was up there was watching him sleep. For his part, Carlos commented that at one point, when he was trying to sleep, he felt pressure on his chest, as if something or someone were sitting on top of him. He described it as the weight of an adult person, but when he opened his eyes, there was nothing there. The pressure had remained for several minutes, making it difficult to breathe, before suddenly lifting. Miguel, who is one of the most skeptical members of our group, told us that he had seen reflections in his bathroom mirror silhouettes that disappeared when he tried to focus his gaze directly on them. But in his peripheral vision, he could see them clearly. Tall, dark figures that seemed to be watching him, studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. We were all exchanging comments about the topic when one of the instructors, Captain Ramirez, approached and said something that chilled us to the bone. The government assigned us this hotel primarily because it was the most economical option available in the area, he began, his expression grave. The reason for its low cost is that a few years ago, it was discovered that a cult was using this hotel for their meetings and rituals. The mention of a cult immediately caused silence among all of us. Captain Ramirez paused, watching our faces, and then said something even worse. There was talk of human sacrifices that were carried out in several of the rooms where you slept last night." He let that sink in before continuing. When this came to light, naturally, the hotel's reputation suffered enormously. Locals and regular visitors began to avoid this place, believing it was cursed or inhabited by malevolent spirits. Although the cult was disbanded and its members arrested, the damage was done. The hotel has been struggling financially ever since, which is why they offer such low rates to government contracts. Hearing that was disturbing in equal measure. On one hand, it wasn't the first time we had heard of cults, as it's relatively common for criminal organizations to have some cult aspects within their ramifications. But for this particular cult to be involved in human sacrifice was something else entirely. The captain explained that the cult had operated for nearly 3 years before being discovered, using the hotel's isolated location and the management's willingness to look the other way in exchange for steady income. The sacrifices, according to the investigation, had taken place in various rooms throughout the hotel. The cult members believed they were channeling dark energies through these acts, and the hotel had become a focal point for their twisted rituals. Multiple victims had been found in different rooms, their deaths violent and ritualistic in nature. For the rest of the nights we remained deployed there, I went directly to the vehicles to sleep as soon as night fell. I didn't even try to return to the room to get my headphones or any other personal items. The thought of spending another night in those cursed walls was more than I could bear. I think we would all agree that it's highly probable that the paranormal phenomena that occurred to several of us were the product of what that cult did in that place. The spirits of the victims, trapped by the violent nature of their deaths and the dark rituals performed over their bodies, were still bound to those rooms. They weren't trying to harm us. They were trying to communicate, to make their presence known, to ensure that their suffering wouldn't be forgotten. Sometimes I wonder if we should have stayed, if we should have tried to help those trapped souls find peace. But then I remember the terror in that room, the malevolent energy that seemed to pulse through the very foundations of the building. And I know we made the right choice. Some places are too stained by evil to ever be cleansed, and that hotel was one of them. My name is James, and for years I served in the United States Army. This experience I'm about to share occurred a couple of years ago, but I still remember every detail as if it had happened yesterday. It was during one of those deployments that you think will be routine, but that end up changing your understanding of life and death forever. We had just returned from an intense firefight in a conflict zone overseas. The battle had been brutal, with explosions echoing throughout the area for hours. One of my closest companions, Ernest, a brave man with whom I had shared countless missions, fell that day. A sniper's bullet had found its mark during what should have been our final sweep of the area. Ernest had no family other than his mother, a woman in her 80s who, upon learning of the tragic news, requested that her son be waked in the living room of her home. Additionally, she asked that some of us stand guard next to the coffin as a final show of honor and respect. I agreed without hesitation, as did my other companion, Lewis. It seemed like the least we could do for a brother who had given everything for his country. We arrived at Ernest's mother's house at dusk. The house was old, with walls worn by humidity, probably because water seeped in during the heavy rains that came each spring in that part of Ohio. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the weight of loss seemed to settle over the entire street like a heavy blanket. The elderly woman, with tearful eyes and a trembling voice, thanked us for being there, and left us alone in the living room with Ernest's closed coffin, while she went to rest for a moment. Up to that point, the woman had been standing in front of her son's coffin for several hours without moving, her grief so profound it seemed to bend the very air around her. It was only right that she should go rest. She was an elderly woman carrying an unbearable burden. Louis and I began our vigil in respectful silence. The only light came from a few candles around the coffin, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move with a life of their own. The scent of the funeral flowers mixed with the mustiness of the old house, creating an atmosphere that was both solemn and oppressive. But as the night progressed, a very strange atmosphere began to be felt in the room. It was as if the air became denser, heavier, pressing down on us with an almost physical weight. In addition to that, light sounds began to be heard, subtle at first, like the settling of old wood, but gradually becoming more pronounced and deliberate. There was something in those sounds that seemed like something was moving, as if something or someone was moving stealthily through the room. Although I tried to convince myself it was the product of my imagination and grief, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And it wasn't the elderly woman. She had gone to sleep quite far from where we were, in a bedroom at the back of the house. At one point, a sharp knock was heard from the ceiling, as if something heavy had fallen in the room above us. Louis and I looked at each other, our eyes meeting in the candlelight with shared concern. We both knew the layout of the house. There was nothing above us but an empty attic that hadn't been used in years. It was then that this cold made itself present, a cold that didn't correspond to the climate of that autumn night. This cold penetrated to the bones, seeming to emanate from the coffin itself, and spread outward like ripples in a pond. Our breath began to come out in visible puffs, and the candle flames flickered wildly despite the absence of any breeze. Suddenly, we began to hear small scratches coming inexplicably from beneath the coffin. It was a very faint sound, like fingernails gently scraping wood, paused but persistent. The sound was rhythmic, almost like a desperate Morse code tapped out by someone trapped and trying to communicate. And then the coffin began to vibrate slightly. We remained motionless, watching as the coffin seemed to move, the scratching sounds continuing with increasing intensity. The flowers on top began to shift, their petals falling like tears onto the floor around us. The very air seemed to thicken further, making it difficult to breathe. The scratches stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sounds had been. And suddenly, the windows slammed shut with a bang that made us jump, despite the fact that there had been no wind moments before. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, and we heard stirring from the back bedroom. That's when Ernest's mother arrived, having heard the noises. In her face, you could see that what she had heard caused her some anguish, but there was also a look of recognition, as if she had been expecting this. Her eyes held a weariness that spoke of previous encounters with the supernatural. So I hurried to calm her down and said, "Everything is fine, ma'am. It's just noises from the house, probably the wind." But even as I spoke the words, I knew they sounded hollow and unconvincing. She looked at us steadily, with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I already knew this was going to happen," she said, with a voice that denoted more weariness than fear. "When my husband died, also in violent circumstances, his soul did not find peace immediately. He fought against his destiny because he couldn't accept that he had died. During his funeral, similar things happened. Louis and I looked at each other, not knowing what to say." The woman's matter-of-fact acceptance of the supernatural was both comforting and unsettling. She spoke of spirits and restless souls as easily as she might discuss the weather. "What happened next? How did your husband find peace?" I asked, hoping to find some solution that could be applied to our fallen friend. The thought that Ernest might be trapped, unable to move on, was more painful than the grief of losing him. "With time and much prayer, I felt that he calmed down," she replied, her voice growing softer. "I also talked to him, as I will now talk to Ernest, to make sure he knows it's okay to let go, that he doesn't have to fight anymore, that he can rest." Her words carried the weight of experience, of someone who had walked this path before. The elderly woman approached the coffin, placing her weathered hand on the cold wood. The gesture was tender, maternal, filled with a love that transcended death itself. "Son, it's time to rest," she murmured with deep sadness before breaking down in tears. "You don't have to fight anymore. You've done your duty, you've served with honor, and now you can go in peace." We remained silent as she continued talking to her son, her voice cracking with emotion, but never losing its strength. She spoke of his childhood, of his dreams to serve his country, of how proud she was of the man he had become. She told him about the flag they would present to her, about how his sacrifice would never be forgotten. Something very strange began to happen in the room as she spoke. The temperature, which had dropped dramatically minutes before, began to change, returning to feel normal little by little. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us lifted gradually, like fog dissipating in the morning sun. The elderly woman, with tears running down her cheeks, continued murmuring words of farewell and peace to her son. Her voice was full of pain from her loss, but also full of love and acceptance. She spoke of heaven, of being reunited with his father, of the peace that awaited him beyond the veil of death. It was as if, somehow, Ernest was really listening to his mother and responding to her call to find peace. The scratching sounds stopped completely. The coffin ceased its subtle movements, and even the candle flames steadied, burning bright and true once more. The very air in the room seemed to lighten, as if a great burden had been lifted. After a few minutes, the woman was exhausted and asked us to please not be scared or leave if anything else happened. We promised her we would stay there, that she could go rest. My companion and I maintained our vigil for 12 more hours, and in all that time there were no other incidents. I believe that after hearing his mother's words, our companion was able to accept that he was dead, and could finally let go of his earthly attachments. The bond between mother and son had proven stronger than death itself, providing the bridge Ernest needed to cross from this world to the next. When our watch ended, we said goodbye to Ernest and his mother. That was an experience that impacted me greatly and has kept me troubled ever since, because I was left thinking that there exists the possibility that if I die in combat, the same thing might happen to me, that when my family is waking me, I might start doing things because I can't accept that I'm already dead. The thought haunts me still. Will I find peace immediately, or will I too fight against my fate, unable to accept the end of my earthly journey? Will I need someone to talk me into the light, or will I be able to let go when my time comes? These are questions that every soldier carries, whether they admit it or not, and Ernest's story made them impossible to ignore. But I also learned something else that night, that love transcends death, that the bonds we form in life don't simply end when our hearts stop beating. Sometimes, those we leave behind become the very guides who help us find our way to whatever comes next. And sometimes, saying goodbye is the greatest gift we can give to those we love. My name is Peter, and about 3.5 years ago, I had to leave the army due to being permanently injured in an encounter that was anything but natural. It wasn't a firefight against insurgents or a rescue mission, but something that defies any logical explanation. It occurred in the year 2021, during the height of the pandemic lockdowns, when the world felt like a different, more isolated place. My unit was on a reconnaissance mission in a remote mountain range in the Pacific Northwest. Our objective was to identify potential zones for environmental monitoring projects as part of a new conservation initiative. The vegetation was dense, and the trails were barely visible among the undergrowth. With the intense afternoon sun filtering through the thick canopy, it made traversing the mountainous terrain extremely difficult. Everything seemed like a routine mission until we reached a small clearing near a mountain stream. The area was perfect for establishing a monitoring station, open enough for equipment placement, but sheltered enough to protect sensitive instruments from the elements. We had been hiking for hours, and the clearing offered our first real opportunity to rest and assess our surroundings properly. While we were there, Martin, the youngest member of our group, noticed something unusual. He was the one taking photographs of the area to document potential sites, using a high-resolution digital camera that would capture details for later analysis. To ensure the photos were properly exposed and composed, he would review each shot immediately after taking it on the camera's LCD screen. Then, while reviewing one particular photograph, he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. He quickly turned toward where he had taken the photograph, pointing with his hand, and asked us if we could see it. Confused, we followed his gaze, squinting into the shadows between the towering pine trees. At first, I saw nothing more than shadows dancing between the tree trunks, patches of darkness created by the interplay of sunlight and foliage. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: birds calling, branches creaking, the distant trickle of water over rocks. But then something moved, something that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the woods. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, too large to be a human, though its bipedal form suggested it might once have been. Its skin appeared to be covered with dark, coarse fur that seemed to absorb the dappled sunlight rather than reflect it. Its eyes caught the light with an animal gleam, but there was an intelligence there that was deeply unsettling, not the simple awareness of a wild beast, but something more complex and malevolent. There it was, what the local indigenous tribes would call a wendigo, though we had no name for it then. It stood observing us from the distance, perfectly still except for the slight rise and fall of its massive chest. For an instant, time seemed to stop. We all held our breath, our bodies tense with uncertainty, every survival instinct screaming that we were in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. The creature's proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that were slightly too long for its frame. Its face was a grotesque parody of human features, stretched and distorted, with a mouth that seemed too wide and filled with teeth that gleamed like yellowed ivory. When it tilted its head, studying us with those burning eyes, the movement was bird-like but predatory. And then, without warning, it launched itself toward us with supernatural speed. The attack was so sudden, so impossibly fast, that our military training barely had time to kick in. The creature moved through the forest like it was part of it, leaping between trees, using branches as springboards, covering ground at a pace that defied physics. The confrontation was chaotic from the very first moments. In the initial seconds of the attack, I saw Henry, who had been beside me trying to load his rifle, get struck by the creature with such force that his body was thrown several yards backward, slamming into a massive pine tree. The impact was sickening, and Henry lay motionless at the base of the tree, his rifle scattered somewhere in the underbrush. The creature was so fast that it was impossible to aim our weapons effectively. In one instant, it would be directly in front of you, and in the next, it had moved to attack someone else entirely. The forest became a nightmare of confused shouts, muzzle flashes, and the sound of breaking branches as we tried desperately to track our target. Our other companion, Jorge, attempted to defend himself with his combat knife, but it was completely useless against the creature's supernatural strength and speed. With a single swipe of its massive clawed hand, the creature knocked Jorge to the ground. What followed was too horrible to describe in detail, but Jorge's screams were cut short by the creature's powerful jaws. The sight of it feeding was something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Thomas and Louis were next in the creature's rampage. Their bodies ended up scattered throughout the clearing, torn apart, with a savagery that spoke of more than simple predation. There was a malevolent intelligence behind the violence, a deliberate cruelty that made it clear this thing took pleasure in our terror and pain. I had managed to maintain some distance up to that point, firing whenever the creature stayed still long enough for me to ensure a shot. But the thing seemed to anticipate our movements, dodging bullets with an agility that shouldn't have been possible for something of its size. My rifle felt inadequate, useless against something that moved like liquid shadow through the forest. Then, in a moment of inattention, I tripped over an exposed root and fell backward. While falling, I saw the creature running toward me with fury in its burning eyes, ready to kill me just like my other companions. The look of hunger and malevolence in its gaze was paralyzing. This wasn't just an animal hunting for food. This was something that enjoyed the hunt, that fed on fear as much as flesh. I aimed my rifle at it while dragging myself backward through the forest debris, firing several times in my panic. Most of my shots went wide, splintering bark and sending pine needles raining down, but one bullet found its mark. The creature roared a sound that was part animal bellow and part something else, something that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself, and lunged toward me. I felt its claws tearing through my skin, felt the burning pain as they raked across my chest and arm. The creature's breath was hot against my face, carrying the stench of decay and something else, something that reminded me of sulfur and ancient earth. Its weight pressed down on me, and I was certain I was about to join my fallen comrades. But at that moment, taking advantage of the fact that the creature was concentrated on killing me. The remaining members of my team, Martin and Ramon, managed to get clear shots. Their combined fire struck the creature multiple times, and it finally collapsed just inches from my face, its massive body pinning me to the forest floor. The creature's death was as unnatural as its life had been. Instead of the normal death throes of an animal, it seemed to deflate, its form becoming less solid, as if whatever dark force had animated it was finally departing. Its eyes, which had burned with malevolent intelligence, became empty and glassy, reflecting nothing but the filtered sunlight above. Despite being trained for high-risk situations, nothing could have prepared us for this encounter. Although we managed to bring down the creature, the wounds I suffered left me on the brink of death, and my recovery was long and painful. The physical scars were nothing compared to the psychological trauma. The nightmares, the constant feeling of being watched, the way shadows seemed to move when they shouldn't. Ramon grabbed the radio and called our base, requesting immediate air support for an emergency extraction. His voice was shaking as he tried to explain our situation without revealing the true nature of what had attacked us. How do you tell command that your unit was decimated by something that shouldn't exist? The minutes that followed were the longest of my life, trapped in that remote location with the bodies of our companions and the creature's corpse beside us. The forest, which had seemed peaceful just hours before, now felt malevolent and watching. Every sound made us jump: the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. We kept our weapons trained on the tree line, terrified that there might be more of these things out there. The creature's body was even more disturbing in death than it had been in life. Up close, we could see that its anatomy was all wrong. The bone structure beneath the matted fur was elongated and twisted, as if something had taken a human skeleton and stretched it like taffy. Its hands were massive, with fingers that ended in claws the length of kitchen knives. Most unsettling of all were its teeth, not the fangs of a predator, but human-like incisors and molars, only larger and filed to sharp points. Finally, the sound of helicopter rotors could be heard approaching through the mountain air. The rescue chopper landed in the clearing, and the medics immediately began working on me, while the others loaded the bodies of our fallen teammates. As we lifted off and began flying away from that cursed place, I could hear the commanding officers discussing how they would handle what had occurred. The official version would be that we had been ambushed by a group of armed militants hiding in the national forest, probably a domestic terrorist cell or drug runners using the remote location for their operations. There would be no mention of the creature or the supernatural circumstances of the encounter. The thing's body would disappear, probably incinerated or buried so deep that no one would ever find it. All of us survivors were instructed to maintain that version under threat of severe repercussions if we disobeyed. This official lie felt like a betrayal to our fallen comrades, but in that moment, being so weakened and overwhelmed, I didn't have the energy to protest. I remained silent, accepting the fabricated story as they rushed me into surgery. The cover-up was thorough and efficient. Our families were told we had encountered terrorists. The media, if they covered the story at all, reported it as another example of domestic extremism in remote areas. The families of the dead received their folded flags and their thanks from a grateful nation. never knowing that their sons had died fighting something that challenged everything we thought we knew about the natural world. But some of us knew the truth. In the months that followed, as I struggled through physical therapy and psychological counseling, I was haunted not just by the memories of that day, but by the implications of what we had encountered. If creatures like that existed, how many others were out there? How many unexplained disappearances in national forests and remote areas were actually the result of encounters with beings like the one that had nearly killed me? I couldn't recover fully from my injuries. The damage to my chest and arm was too extensive, and the psychological trauma made it impossible for me to continue serving effectively. After 2 years of unsuccessful treatment and rehabilitation, I was medically discharged from the Army. The official reason was combat-related PTSD from a terrorist encounter. The real reason was that I had seen something that wasn't supposed to exist and lived to tell about it. Now, 3.5 years later, I no longer care what they might do to me for telling this story. The weight of keeping this secret has been heavier than any physical injury I sustained that day. People deserve to know that there are things in the deep woods, in the places where civilization hasn't fully taken hold, that are hostile to human life in ways we can't fully comprehend. The indigenous peoples of this continent knew about these creatures long before European settlers arrived. They had names for them, rituals to protect against them, and the wisdom to stay away from certain places at certain times. We, in our arrogance, dismissed their stories as folklore and superstition. We were wrong. I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, hearing that otherworldly roar echoing through my dreams. I still see those burning eyes watching me from the shadows of my memory. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I wonder if the creature we killed was just one of many, and if somewhere out there in the wilderness, others like it are still hunting, still waiting for the next group of unsuspecting humans to wander into their territory. The mountains keep their secrets well, but some secrets are too dangerous to keep forever. This is mine, and now it's yours too. Believe it or don't, that's your choice. But if you ever find yourself in the deep woods, far from civilization, and you see something moving in the shadows that doesn't belong there, remember this story. Remember what happened to my unit, and run. I've always believed there are places where time doesn't work the way it should. Locations where the past didn't just leave scars, but lingers in the air, waiting for someone to discover it. I never believed in the paranormal, but after what I experienced at that old military installation in Colorado, I have no other way to explain it. My name is Marcus, and I'm a former Army sergeant. During my 12 years of service, I saw plenty of things, some good, others I'd rather forget. But there's one particular incident that stayed with me, something I could never explain, something that still haunts me when I close my eyes at night. It happened about 8 years ago when I was assigned to Fort Shadowmere, a decommissioned military base in the remote mountains of Colorado. The place wasn't large or strategically important anymore, but they still used it for specialized training exercises and temporary housing for personnel in transit. The locals in the nearest town, about 30 miles away, always seemed uneasy when you mentioned the fort, as if they avoided getting too close to it. One of my fellow soldiers mentioned that during the Cold War, It had been used for classified interrogations and detention of suspected enemy agents. That's when I knew the place carried heavy energy. I arrived on a bitter February night, the mountain air cutting through my jacket as I stepped off the transport truck. From the first moment, I felt something odd, as if the atmosphere there was heavier than normal. There wasn't much lighting, just a few flickering floodlights that barely kept the darkness at bay. It didn't worry me at the time. I'd spent nights in much worse conditions during deployments overseas. They assigned us rooms in the main building, but I was placed in the most isolated section, a hallway that housed only storage rooms and an abandoned office that, according to what they told me, had once been used for prisoner interrogations during the facility's active years. I didn't think much of it at the time, simply unpacked my gear and tried to get some rest. But not even 2 hours had passed when I was awakened by a strange sound. It wasn't a loud noise, more like murmuring, distant voices mixing with the mountain wind. I got up, opened the door, and looked down the hallway. It was empty. The fluorescent light flickered slightly, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I assumed it was other soldiers on night patrol, so I went back to bed. But falling asleep wasn't easy. There was a moment when I felt someone walking slowly past my door. I didn't see shadows and didn't hear footsteps either. I just felt a presence, something inexplicable, as if someone was standing right outside my door, watching me through the wood. I told myself it was just fatigue and eventually managed to fall asleep despite that unsettling feeling. The next morning, while exploring the facility, I found a small room where they stored old documents. There were dusty folders stacked on shelves and boxes full of files that seemed untouched for decades. I've always been curious about the history of places where I'm stationed, so I began reviewing some papers. The first ones were maintenance reports, supply lists, and personnel records from the 1970s and 80s. But after a while, I found something else, an older folder different from the rest. It had no title, just a serial number that was almost illegible. When I opened it, I was shocked by what I read. It was a list of missing persons. There were names, dates, and some photos of young men with haunted expressions, people who were never found. I read through several descriptions, and almost all mentioned the same thing. Detained for reasons that were never specified, transferred to unknown locations, none recorded in official files. These weren't soldiers. They were civilians, suspected dissidents, activists, people who had simply disappeared into the system during the height of Cold War paranoia. And then I saw it, my surname. I had to read it several times to make sure my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. But there it was. A man with my exact last name disappeared at that same facility decades earlier. The file showed he'd been brought in for questioning about alleged communist sympathies and was never seen again. A chill ran down my spine. I'd never heard anyone in my family mention someone who had served in that area, much less someone who had disappeared without a trace. But there was his name, right there in that forgotten document. The dates showed he'd vanished in 1973, exactly 50 years before my assignment there. My mind tried to find a logical explanation. It could be a coincidence, someone unrelated to me. But part of me knew it wasn't that simple. The feeling that had been growing since my arrival suddenly made sense. This place had been calling to me. One night while conducting my patrol rounds, I noticed that one of the lights was flickering in the narrow hallway near my quarters. It wasn't the first time it had happened, but this time there was something different. In the dim light, I could see a motionless silhouette at the far end of the corridor. I thought it was another soldier, so I called out, but received no response. The figure remained there, standing with an unnaturally rigid posture. I advanced a few steps and suddenly felt a chill run down my back. The temperature at that spot was noticeably lower than in the rest of the building. When I tried to focus my vision better, the figure seemed to move slightly, as if taking a step toward me. But I heard no sound of footsteps, just the soft echo of my own breathing in the cold air. I decided to retreat and report the anomaly, but when I turned to leave, a hoarse and distorted voice whispered my name. Not my rank or last name, my first name, spoken with an intimacy that made my blood freeze. At that instant, all the lights in the hallway began to flicker violently, and a deep humming sound filled my ears, so intense it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I don't know how I managed to move, but as soon as I could, I fumbled for the main light switch and flooded the corridor with harsh fluorescent light. The figure vanished. The next day I pretended everything was normal, but I knew it wasn't. I didn't mention what I'd seen to anyone, didn't tell anyone about the name on the list or about the figure in the hallway. But I couldn't live with the uncertainty. I searched for more information about my family, called several relatives, and finally, after insisting, an uncle revealed something I never could have imagined. My grandfather had a younger brother who had disappeared when he was in his 20s. The family never talked much about it. They only said that one day government agents took him away for a crime he didn't commit, supposedly asking the wrong questions about government policies during the McCarthy era. They never saw him again, and my family never found out what happened to him. The official story was that he'd been released and chose to start a new life elsewhere. But deep down, everyone knew that wasn't true. Now I knew the real story. He had been at that facility, and somehow he was still there, trapped in those cold corridors, waiting for someone from his family to find him, to acknowledge what had happened to him. I don't know what he expected from me. I don't know if he just wanted someone to know his story, if he wanted to be recognized, or if he was simply trapped in time, in a place that wouldn't let him go. What I do know is that I left that facility with the feeling that he had found me before I found him. Sometime later, I was reassigned to a base in Texas. I never spoke about this with my superiors and never returned to Fort Shadowmere. The facility was permanently decommissioned the following year, though they never explained why. To this day, I still wonder if I was really the one who found him, or if he was somehow waiting for me, knowing that someday, someone from his family would walk those same halls and finally learn the truth about what happened in that forgotten place in the Colorado mountains. I don't know if anyone will believe me. I suppose it doesn't matter much. The reason I'm telling this isn't to convince anyone, but to release it, to get it out of my head, even if just for a few minutes. I've learned that true hell doesn't always come when you die. Sometimes it catches up with you much earlier, and the worst part is bringing it upon yourself. Years ago, I moved through a dark world, a world I now try to forget. I was part of something many call business, though there's nothing clean about it. I worked for a drug cartel operating along the Texas-Mexico border, doing jobs not everyone is willing to do. It was easy at first. A gunshot here, a phone call there, and money arrived without asking too many questions. But like everything in life, you get used to it. It becomes routine. I never cared what happened after each job or who they were. For me, they were simply orders I had to follow. Until one day, I stopped feeling right about what I was doing. I don't know exactly when everything changed, but I started looking at the people I eliminated, remembering their faces, thinking about their families. I realized that no matter how much money I made, it wasn't worth what I was losing inside. So I quit. Well, I tried to. I knew it wouldn't be easy to leave that world, but I had some contacts who owed me favors, and they helped me disappear. I moved to a small town forgotten by time in rural New Mexico, far from everything. Nobody knew me, and that was the idea. I thought that by leaving it behind, things would start to get better. I was wrong. The first year in town was quiet. I got a job as a night security guard at a small manufacturing plant on the outskirts. Nothing special, but enough to live in peace. Days passed slowly and nights were even quieter, but that suited me fine. I needed that calm to forget. But then things started happening. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. After all, when you've spent years looking over your shoulder, it's hard to let go of that fear. The first time I noticed it was on a night about 3 years ago. I was alone in my small house. It was late, and I was about to go to bed. The house isn't very big, single story with 2 bedrooms, nothing special. I went to the bathroom to wash my face, and while leaning over the sink, I felt something strange. That sensation you get when you know someone is watching you. I immediately turned toward the window that faced the backyard, and there he was. It was nothing more than a shadow, but I recognized that figure as soon as I saw it. He was standing a few meters from the house, looking toward the window. My heart stopped for a second, and I swear I felt my blood freeze. It was one of them, one of those I had eliminated. His face was blurry in the darkness, but I knew it was him. I remembered him well because, before I did the job, he had knelt down begging for mercy. Something that didn't usually happen. I never understood why at the time, but now he was in front of me, watching me. I turned off the bathroom light, trembling. I didn't have the courage to look again. I got into bed as if that would protect me, but I knew it wouldn't. I spent the night awake, expecting that thing to appear again. However, it didn't. The next day I got up exhausted, but convinced I had dreamed it. Or that's what I wanted to believe. During the following weeks, I started noticing more strange things. Sometimes, walking through town, I realized someone was following me. At first, it was just a fleeting shadow I saw out of the corner of my eye. Other times, while driving, I seemed to see someone in the back seat. But when I turned my head, no one was there. These were all small details that made me feel something was wrong, but the most disturbing thing was when I began to recognize those faces. It was as if, little by little, all the people I had executed, those I was trying to forget, began to appear around me. At first it was just one, then another, and so on. I saw some from afar, others for barely a second, but they were there. Silent, watching. And every time I saw them, I smelled that odor. A smell of wet earth mixed with gunpowder. It was a penetrating aroma that brought back memories I didn't want to relive. Once walking through the town center, I crossed paths with one of them. His face was white, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years, and his eyes were empty. My heart started pounding in my chest. We looked at each other for a few seconds, and then he simply disappeared into the crowd. I tried to keep walking as if nothing had happened, but my legs were shaking. I knew it was impossible, that he couldn't be there. He was already dead. The apparitions became more frequent, so much so that I began to think I was going crazy. I started avoiding going out at night, but it didn't matter. Sometimes I could feel someone was in the room with me, even though I was alone. I heard whispers in the darkness, footsteps that made no sound, but I knew something or someone was there. One night I was sitting in my small living room with the lights off, trying to calm my mind. I heard a loud noise coming from the patio. I got up, heart racing, and when I looked out the window, I saw him again. That figure, that same man. He was there standing in the middle of the patio, but this time his face was clearer, more visible. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, though dark, seemed to pierce right through me. He wasn't saying anything, just looking at me. It was then I understood he wasn't going away. He had come to stay. That night, for the first time in years, I prayed. I'm not a religious man, never have been. But at that moment, with that man standing in my patio, I didn't know what else to do. I felt like the air was escaping me, as if something was squeezing my chest. I prayed for him to leave, for them to leave me in peace, but the sensation didn't disappear. I knew that, in some corner of my soul, I was paying for what I had done. The next morning, when I finally dared to go out to the patio, there was nothing there. But the smell remained, that mixture of earth and gunpowder. Since that day, I haven't been able to get rid of that feeling of being watched, of being followed. It doesn't matter where I go. There's always someone there, watching me from a distance. The appearances became more bold after that night. I'd see them in broad daylight now, standing across the street from my work, sitting in the diner where I ate lunch, walking behind me in the grocery store. Always silent, always watching. The townspeople started asking if I was feeling all right. I guess the constant fear was showing on my face. I tried moving to another town, thinking distance might help, but they came with me. If anything, they seemed stronger away from that first place, more solid, more real. I realized then that geography wasn't the issue. The problem was me. I was carrying them with me wherever I went. I started having conversations with them in my head, apologizing, explaining that I was different now, that I regretted everything. But they never responded. They just watched with those hollow eyes, a constant reminder of the lives I'd taken, the families I'd destroyed, the futures I'd stolen. I don't know if they're real ghosts or if it's my conscience torturing me, but what I do know is that, in the end, you can't escape your past. Even though I've distanced myself from that world, what I did still follows me, like a debt that can't be paid. As I said from the beginning, hell isn't a place you go when you die. Sometimes you bring it with you, and it accompanies you wherever you go. The worst part is not knowing if they'll ever forgive me, or if I'll spend the rest of my life carrying these shadows. All I can do is keep living, keep trying to be a better person, hoping that somehow, someday, it will be enough. But deep down, I know that some debts can never be fully paid, and some ghosts never truly leave. My name is Jake, and I served in the Texas Army National Guard for almost 12 years. Of everything I experienced during my service, there were many difficult things, experiences that marked me, but only one continues to haunt me to this day. It has nothing to do with combat, operations, or confrontations. No, what happened to me that night was different. It was something I could never explain, and that, over the years, has made me wonder what things really inhabit the lonely roads of this state. This happened in 2018, when I was assigned to a highway patrol unit in West Texas. They sent us to check routes with reports of suspicious activity, sometimes drug trafficking, other times vehicle theft, kidnappings, or simply something that alerted civilians and required inspection. The area where this occurred is one of those places where you can drive for miles without seeing anything but desert, with scattered towns and gas stations every 40 or 50 miles. In the early morning hours, you wouldn't see a soul. We received a radio call about a cargo truck stopped on the side of Highway 287. A trucker who passed by reported seeing it with its lights on and the door open, but he didn't stop. He said it seemed suspicious. Since we were about 30 minutes from the location, they ordered us to investigate. When we arrived, it was almost 3 in the morning. The highway was completely silent, barely illuminated by our unit's headlights and the truck's running lights. It was a large vehicle, one of those used to transport heavy freight, with the engine off but the cab lights on. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. But no one was visible. My partner and I got out cautiously, checking the perimeter. Nothing. There were no recent footprints in the sand or signs that anyone had gotten out and walked around. I approached the driver's door and looked inside. The first thing I noticed was that the truck's radio was on, but it was only emitting white noise, an irregular, choppy sound. In the passenger seat, there was a backpack with clothes, a half-empty water bottle, and a wallet with identification. The driver was a man in his mid-40s named Robert Martinez, but he wasn't there. We decided to check the back of the truck. My partner shined his flashlight while I tried to open the door, but it was locked. We thought about breaking it open, but before doing so, we heard something in the cab. A sound, as if someone was adjusting the radio. We returned to the driver's door and saw that the radio was no longer emitting white noise. Now, we could hear something different. It sounded like words, but they weren't clear. It sounded like someone speaking in a low voice, but choppy and distorted. Then suddenly, through the static, we heard a clear phrase, a deep, dragged-out voice that said, "This place is worse than hell." We were speechless. We searched around us with our flashlights to see if we could spot anything else, but the highway was empty. Not a single car had passed the entire time we'd been there. Even so, we quickly circled the truck with our weapons ready, and obviously, no one was there. My partner tried to turn off the radio, but when he touched it, the sound disappeared suddenly, as if it had never been on. We looked at each other without saying anything. Something didn't add up, and nothing had a logical explanation. We sent in our report and decided to wait for backup. While we waited, we started reviewing the truck's papers, and that's when everything became even stranger. The truck's last inspection was from 2 weeks ago, but the engine was still warm as if it had been used recently. It didn't make sense. The registration showed it belonged to Martinez Freight Services, a small family-owned trucking company based in Amarillo. The worst part came next. When we better illuminated the side of the truck, we saw marks on the body. They weren't dents or scratches. They were stains. Dark, dried stains that looked like they had been dragged. As we got closer, we noticed more things. On the ground right next to the truck, there were remnants of duct tape and fragments of cut rope. You didn't need to be an expert to realize that something very bad had happened there. My partner looked at me, and without needing to speak, we knew we had stumbled upon something that didn't belong to us, something that perhaps was no longer on this plane of existence. A few minutes later, the backup team arrived. They searched the truck, took photos, and inspected the area. They found no more clues about the driver, only traces of what appeared to have been an attempt to move or hide something. The truck's cargo area, when they finally got it open, was completely empty except for some old moving blankets and more of those dark stains. But what really left me unsettled was what our superiors told us after making some calls. The truck did have an owner. It was the man from the wallet, Robert Martinez. But he had disappeared along with his vehicle 5 days earlier, and there were no records of the truck passing through any checkpoint, toll booth, or gas station during that time. They found it there, in the middle of nowhere, without anyone knowing how it got there. What made it even more mysterious was the radio transmission we'd heard. When the investigators tested all the radio equipment, everything was functioning normally, but there was no record of any transmission on that frequency at that time. The CB radio in the truck had been tuned to channel 19, the standard trucker channel. But according to the communications log, no one had broadcast anything on that channel for hours. The days following, the case disappeared from the reports. No more was said about it, and we never received news about what happened to the truck or the driver. The official report listed it as an abandoned vehicle, with the driver presumed to have left voluntarily, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. But I keep asking myself what we found that night. Did someone else drive it to that point? Why were there no footprints or traces of recent activity besides those ominous stains? What spoke through that radio with such clarity and malice? I can't stop thinking about that night and that truck. I want to know if it could have simply been an abandoned vehicle, or if what we encountered and heard was something beyond our understanding. The voice we heard didn't sound human. It was too distorted, too filled with an emotion I can only describe as eternal anguish. I've driven that stretch of highway dozens of times since then, always during daylight hours. I've never seen anything unusual, but I've talked to other patrol officers, and some have mentioned strange reports from that area over the years. Vehicles found in impossible locations, radio transmissions that can't be traced, and always that same stretch of highway where cell phone signals mysteriously cut out for about 5 miles. The worst part is that to this day, no one knows what happened to Robert Martinez. His family hired private investigators, put up missing person posters throughout West Texas, and even offered a substantial reward for information. But he vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only that mysterious truck and the echo of those terrifying words we heard through the static. Sometimes I wonder if we weren't meant to find that truck at all, but something wanted us to witness what remained of whatever happened there. Something wanted those words to be heard, recorded, remembered. And now, whenever I drive those lonely highways at night, I can't shake the feeling that there are places where the boundary between our world and something else becomes dangerously thin. My name is Marcus, and I served in the Army for 8 years across multiple deployments. I've seen combat zones that would break most people, spent months in forward operating bases that felt like the edge of civilization, and witnessed things that still visit me in my dreams. But of all the experiences I've had, there's one that continues to haunt me, something that defies explanation, something my unit agreed never to discuss once we returned stateside. It happened during the winter of 2014 in eastern Syria, near the Iraqi border. Our FOB was strategically positioned in what used to be a thriving agricultural region, but years of conflict had turned it into a wasteland of abandoned villages and crumbling infrastructure. The landscape stretched endlessly, barren fields dotted with the skeletal remains of burnt-out buildings, all under a sky that seemed perpetually gray. Winter nights in that part of the world are brutal. The temperature drops below freezing, and the wind cuts through you like a blade. Outside our perimeter, there was nothing but darkness and the occasional howl of wild dogs scavenging through the ruins. I was pulling my shift in the communications bunker when we intercepted a transmission that would change everything. It was around 0200 hours on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd been counting down the days until my rotation ended. The radio crackled to life with a military distress signal, transmitted in proper Army code. Standard procedure, nothing unusual about receiving emergency communications. What made my blood run cold was the unit designation in the transmission. According to our database, that unit didn't exist. Not anymore. I immediately contacted our operations center, ran it by intelligence, even reached out to neighboring bases through encrypted channels. Nobody had any record of that designation being active in our area of operations. In fact, nobody had any record of it being active anywhere. But the signal kept coming through, clear as day, repeating the same distress code every 15 minutes like clockwork. We triangulated the source to an abandoned Syrian army outpost about 12 clicks northeast of our position. Intelligence briefings indicated the facility had been evacuated and destroyed during coalition airstrikes nearly 3 years earlier, after enemy forces had been using it as a staging area for attacks against civilian targets. Command assembled a reconnaissance team, and I volunteered to go. Something about that transmission bothered me, not just the unknown unit designation, but the quality of the signal itself. It was too clean, too strong for equipment that should have been reduced to scrap metal years ago. The convoy consisted of 2 MRAPs and 8 personnel, including our team leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran of 3 deployments who'd seen more action than most career soldiers. The drive through the abandoned countryside was tense. Dead villages passed by our windows like monuments to a war that had consumed everything in its path. Collapsed bridges forced us to take longer routes through terrain that made everyone nervous. Rodriguez kept checking his watch and scanning the horizon through his binoculars. None of us talked much during the journey, but you could feel the unease in the vehicle. It was one of those missions where your gut tells you something isn't right, but your training pushes you forward anyway. When we reached the coordinates, we found exactly what the intelligence reports had described: a compound reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The main buildings had been pancaked by precision-guided munitions, and smaller structures were blackened by fire. Unexploded ordnance warnings were spray-painted on what remained of the outer walls, in both Arabic and English. But as we moved through the debris field, we discovered something that shouldn't have been there. In what used to be the command center, partially buried under concrete chunks and rebar, we found signs of recent habitation. MREs with expiration dates from the previous year scattered around a makeshift living area. Sleeping bags arranged in military formation. Personal items, photographs, letters, even a deck of cards, spread across a folding table as if someone had left in the middle of a game. The strangest part was how fresh everything looked. The sleeping bags weren't faded by sun exposure. The food wrappers weren't weathered or torn. It was as if people had been living there recently, despite the fact that the compound had been uninhabitable for years. Sergeant Rodriguez was documenting everything with his camera when Private Chen called out from deeper in the ruins. He'd found the source of our transmission, a military radio set, partially buried, but still operational. The antenna had been jury-rigged with spare wire and metal fragments, creating a transmission array that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Chen plugged in his analysis equipment and pulled up the transmission logs. What he found made all of us step back from the radio. The last logged transmission from that unit had been in November 2011. 3 years before we intercepted their distress signal. But somehow, impossibly, the radio was still broadcasting. Still sending out that same emergency code, as if the operators were still alive, still waiting for rescue from a position that had been obliterated by coalition forces years earlier. Rodriguez made the decision to shut down the transmission. Protocol dictated that we secure any enemy communications equipment, and there was no tactical reason to leave an active radio in the field. But as Chen reached for the power switch, the static pattern changed. A voice emerged from the speakers, weak, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Is anyone there?" We froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The voice was speaking English with an American accent, though the signal distortion made it difficult to make out clearly. "We need immediate evacuation. Our position is compromised." Chen tried to respond, keying the handset to request identification, but the voice cut him off. "They're almost through the perimeter. We can't hold much longer." Then something happened that I still can't explain. The background static began to change, forming patterns that sounded almost like gunfire, like explosions, like men shouting orders in the distance. But it wasn't quite right. The sounds were too hollow, too ethereal, as if they were echoes of something that had happened long ago. "Tell my wife I tried to make it home," the voice said, barely audible now. "Tell her I—" The radio went silent. Not just quiet, completely dead, as if someone had cut the power from the other end. We stood there in the ruins, staring at the radio, waiting for someone to offer a rational explanation. Rodriguez finally broke the silence by ordering us to pack up everything we could carry and get back to the vehicles. None of us needed encouragement. During the ride back to base, nobody talked about what we'd heard. We delivered our collected evidence to intelligence and filed our reports, carefully avoiding any mention of the voices or the impossible transmission logs. The official record stated that we had secured abandoned enemy communications equipment and found no signs of current enemy activity. But 3 days later, something happened that still keeps me awake at night. Private Chen, the soldier who had tried to respond to that final transmission, disappeared during a routine patrol. His squad was conducting a standard security sweep of the roads leading to our base when his vehicle simply stopped responding to radio calls. When the search team found his Humvee 2 hours later, it was parked on the side of the road with the engine still running and all doors wide open. His gear was still in the vehicle, his weapon was still secured in its mount, but Chen was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of enemy contact, no footprints leading away from the vehicle. The other members of his patrol swore they had visual contact with his vehicle just minutes before losing radio communication. Security cameras at a nearby checkpoint showed his Humvee passing through right on schedule, with Chen clearly visible in the driver's seat. But somewhere between that checkpoint and his next scheduled radio check, he had simply vanished. The investigation went on for weeks. Search teams combed every inch of the surrounding area. Intelligence analysts reviewed satellite imagery and intercepted communications. The Army even brought in a psychological operations team to determine if enemy forces might have used some kind of sophisticated deception to capture one of our soldiers. They found nothing. Private Chen had disappeared as completely and inexplicably as if he had never existed. The radio at the abandoned outpost never transmitted again. But sometimes, late at night when I was pulling communications watch, I would tune through the frequencies and wonder if somewhere out there, another unit was receiving a distress call from our fob, a signal that would keep broadcasting long after we had all gone home, long after our war had ended, reaching out across time to soldiers who could never answer back. The question that haunts me isn't what happened to Chen, though that mystery eats at me every day. The question that keeps me awake is simpler and somehow more terrifying. If that radio had been broadcasting the same distress signal for 3 years, sending out calls for help that no one could answer, who finally turned it off when we arrived? My name is David, and I spent 12 years in the Army, including multiple tours in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. I've faced down insurgents, survived IED attacks, and endured months of psychological warfare in places where the enemy could be anyone, anywhere, at any time. But if there's one experience that fundamentally changed how I view the world, it was what happened during my assignment to a remote observation post along the Arizona-Mexico border. This was back in 2016, when border security was being reinforced with advanced surveillance technology and increased military presence. Our outpost was one of dozens scattered across the desert, each one responsible for monitoring a specific sector of the borderlands. The landscape was unforgiving. Miles of scrubland interrupted by rocky outcroppings and dry arroyos that could hide anything from drug smugglers to coyotes leading migrants across the desert. Our mission was straightforward. Watch for illegal crossings, report suspicious activity, and provide intelligence to Border Patrol agents who would handle any actual interdictions. The work was monotonous, but critical hour after hour of scanning the horizon through thermal optics, logging every heat signature that moved through our sector. The team consisted of 6 soldiers, rotating through 12-hour shifts that stretched from sunset to sunrise. The desert at night is a different world entirely. Temperatures drop 40 degrees once the sun goes down, and the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. During winter months, frost would form on the equipment, and you'd need chemical heating pads just to keep the electronics functioning. It was around midnight on a Thursday when Specialist Morrison, operating the thermal surveillance system from Tower 3, reported movement in Grid 7 Alpha. This was about 2 clicks north of the actual border, in an area where we occasionally saw smugglers testing our response times or migrants who had become disoriented in the darkness. "I've got a single individual moving northeast at approximately 3 clicks per hour," Morrison reported through the comm system. "No obvious equipment or cargo visible. Standard protocol called for continued observation until the subject either turned back south or moved close enough to our position to warrant alerting border patrol." But then Morrison's voice came through the radio again, with a tone I'd never heard from him before. Control, this is Tower 3. The subject appears to be human-sized and human-shaped, but I'm not reading any thermal signature. 0 heat emission." I was serving as shift supervisor that night, so I climbed up to Morrison's position to verify the sighting. Through the thermal scope, I could clearly see a bipedal figure moving steadily across the desert floor. The gait was human, the proportions were human, but the imaging system showed it as cold as the surrounding rocks and dead vegetation. At first, we assumed it was someone wearing specialized clothing designed to defeat thermal detection, the kind of gear that high-end smuggling operations sometimes used. But even the most advanced thermal camouflage couldn't completely eliminate a human heat signature, especially not in the cool desert air where body heat would contrast sharply with the environment. Morrison tracked the figure for 23 minutes as it moved in a straight line toward a cluster of abandoned buildings that had once been a mining operation. The structures had been empty for decades, according to our briefing materials, and were marked as potential hiding spots for illegal border crossers. "Subject has stopped moving," Morrison reported, now stationary approximately 50 meters south of the abandoned structures. I made the decision to investigate. Sergeant Williams and I geared up with night vision equipment and drove out in one of our ATVs to get a closer look. The ride took 18 minutes across rough terrain, and the whole time I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right about the situation. When we reached the area where Morrison had last seen the figure, we found fresh tracks in the sand, clear boot prints leading toward the abandoned buildings. But the tracks ended abruptly at a flat stretch of hardpan desert, as if whoever had been walking had simply disappeared mid-stride. Williams and I spent 40 minutes searching the area with our handheld thermal units and night vision goggles. We checked every building, every piece of cover large enough to conceal a human being. We found evidence of previous occupation, old campfires, discarded water bottles, pieces of torn clothing, but nothing recent, and certainly no sign of whoever had left those tracks. The strangest part was the atmosphere of the place itself. Both Williams and I commented on it during the drive back to base. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the pressure drop you experience before a severe thunderstorm. But the night was clear, with no weather systems anywhere in the region. That should have been the end of it, another unexplained sighting in a job full of unexplained sightings. But it wasn't. The next night, Morrison reported the same phenomenon. Same grid reference, same movement pattern, same lack of thermal signature. This time, the figure approached even closer to our outpost before vanishing in the same inexplicable way. By the third night, word had spread among the team. Everyone wanted to see the thermal ghost, as someone had started calling it. Corporal Jackson took over the surveillance station and confirmed Morrison's reports. A human-shaped figure moving through the desert without producing any detectable body heat. That's when things started getting personal. Jackson reported that the figure had stopped approximately 300 meters from our base and appeared to be facing our direction. For nearly an hour, it remained completely motionless, as if observing our position the same way we were observing it. "I think it knows we're watching," Jackson said over the comm. There was uncertainty in his voice, the kind of doubt that creeps in when your training doesn't provide explanations for what you're experiencing. I took over the thermal optics to see for myself. The figure was exactly where Jackson had described, a human silhouette standing in the open desert, perfectly still. Even through the electronic display, there was something unsettling about its posture, something that suggested intelligence and purpose, rather than the random wandering of a lost border crosser. Then it moved, not toward the border, not toward cover, but directly toward our outpost. The movement was wrong. Humans don't walk like that, with such mechanical precision, such unnatural steadiness. It maintained a perfectly consistent pace across terrain that should have required constant adjustments for rocks, holes, and changes in elevation. "All stations, we have an approaching individual," I announced over the base comm system. "Everyone to defensive positions." The figure continued its approach for 12 minutes before stopping again, now only 100 meters from our perimeter. At that distance, even without thermal detection, we should have been able to see it with conventional night vision equipment. But when we switched to standard optics, there was nothing there. The thermal display still showed the figure clearly. But through night vision goggles, binoculars, even with our searchlights, the space where it should have been was completely empty. That's when I realized we were dealing with something beyond our training and experience. The figure remained motionless for the rest of the night. At 0600 hours, as dawn began to break over the desert, the thermal signature simply faded away like morning mist, leaving us staring at empty desert through our surveillance equipment. None of us slept well that day. During shift change, there were whispered conversations about what we had witnessed, but nobody wanted to file an official report about a contact that couldn't be confirmed through multiple sensor systems. Sergeant Martinez, who had been stationed at remote outposts for most of his career, pulled me aside that afternoon. "This has happened before," he said quietly, making sure no one else could hear. "Different locations, different units, but the same phenomenon. Command doesn't like reports about things that can't be explained." I pressed him for details, but Martinez would only say that some places along the border had a reputation among long-term personnel, areas where standard surveillance equipment would detect things that shouldn't exist, where experienced soldiers would request transfers after just a few months of duty. "My advice," he said, "is to log it as equipment malfunction and request recalibration of the thermal systems. Let the tech specialists figure out what's wrong with the sensors." But I knew there was nothing wrong with our equipment. That night the figure appeared again. This time, it approached to within 50 meters of our base before stopping. Through the thermal display, I could see it clearly, human-shaped, but somehow different, as if the proportions weren't quite right for a normal person. And then something happened that I still can't rationalize. The figure raised what appeared to be its arm and pointed directly at Tower 3, where I was conducting surveillance. Despite the distance, despite the electronic nature of the thermal display, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if something was looking back at me through the optics. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a feeling of being observed, studied, evaluated by something that understood me far better than I understood it. My hands started shaking, and I had to step away from the surveillance equipment. When I looked again, the figure was gone. We never reported the incident through official channels. Martinez helped me draft a maintenance request for the thermal systems, and a technical team came out the following week to recalibrate all of our surveillance equipment. They found nothing wrong, of course, but their presence provided a convenient explanation for any unusual readings we might have recorded. The sightings stopped after that, at least during my remaining time at the outpost. But other strange things began happening. Motion sensors would trigger in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. Electronic equipment would malfunction during routine operations, and several members of our team reported feeling watched during their shifts, especially when working alone. I completed my rotation and transferred to a different assignment, grateful to leave that stretch of desert behind. But 6 months later, I happened to run into Morrison at a training facility in Texas. Over drinks, I asked him if the thermal ghost had ever returned. No, he said, looking uncomfortable with the subject. But other weird stuff started happening after you left. Guys would see movement in their peripheral vision, but nothing on the sensors. Equipment would turn on by itself during the day shift. And sometimes, when you were alone in one of the towers, you'd hear footsteps on the metal stairs. But when you looked, nobody was there. He paused for a moment, staring into his beer. The worst part was the new guy they sent to replace you. Kid named Peterson, fresh out of training. He lasted 3 weeks before requesting emergency transfer. Said he couldn't sleep because someone was walking around inside the base at night, checking on the sleeping quarters. Morrison looked up at me with an expression I recognized. The look of someone who had seen something beyond the normal scope of military experience. The thing is, Peterson's bunk was on the 2nd floor of building. See, the footsteps he heard were on the floor above him. But Building C only has 2 floors. I never went back to that outpost, and I never filed any reports about what we had experienced there. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that figure in the desert, the thermal ghost that appeared night after night, moving through the darkness without heat, without substance, but with purpose. And I wonder if somewhere along the border, another team of soldiers is watching their thermal displays, trying to rationalize the impossible, trying to explain why their equipment keeps detecting something that shouldn't exist. The question that haunts me isn't what we saw out there in the desert. The question is whether it's still there, still watching, still waiting for something that only it understands. My name is Robert, and I served in the United States Army for 14 years, including deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and various training assignments across the continental United States. During that time, I learned that military life operates on precision. Every movement is accounted for, every soldier is tracked, and every formation is counted twice. There's no room for error when lives depend on knowing exactly who is where at any given moment. But in 2015, while stationed at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, I witnessed something that challenged everything I understood about military protocol, and honestly, about reality itself. I was serving as a staff sergeant in an intelligence unit, responsible for training new analysts in surveillance and reconnaissance techniques. It was routine work, but critical. These soldiers would be deployed to active combat zones, where their skills could mean the difference between life and death for entire units. Fort Huachuca sits in the Sonoran Desert, surrounded by mountains and vast stretches of high desert terrain. It's an old installation, dating back to the 1800s, with a history that includes everything from cavalry operations against Apache warriors to modern electronic warfare training. The base has a reputation among long-term military personnel, not necessarily negative, but there are stories, whispers about things that don't quite fit the official narrative. The incident I'm about to describe occurred during a routine evening formation in late September. The temperature was finally starting to drop after months of brutal summer heat, and we were transitioning from summer to winter training schedules. Evening formations were standard procedure, a way to account for all personnel before dismissing them for evening chow and personal time. I was serving as formation supervisor that night, which meant I was responsible for calling roll and ensuring proper head count before releasing the soldiers. We had 26 personnel assigned to our unit at that time, and evening formation was scheduled for 1900 hours in the main courtyard between barracks 7 and 8. The soldiers assembled in standard formation, 3 rows of 8, with additional personnel filling out the final row. I began the roll call process, working from my roster and calling out names in alphabetical order. Everything proceeded normally until I reached the end of the list. My count was off. Instead of 26 soldiers, I had 27 standing in formation. At first, I assumed I had miscounted, or that someone from another unit had accidentally joined our formation. It happened occasionally when soldiers were reassigned, or when temporary personnel were attached to our unit for training purposes. But when I recounted, the number remained the same, 27. I stopped the formation and asked if anyone had joined us who wasn't on my roster. No one responded. I asked if anyone had been transferred to our unit that day without my being notified. Again, no response. That's when I noticed the soldier standing in the back row, on the far right side of the formation. He was wearing a standard Army combat uniform, but without any visible rank insignia or unit patches. His posture was correct, his positioning was precise, and his general appearance was consistent with military grooming standards. But something about him seemed off in a way I couldn't immediately identify. I approached him directly and asked for his name and unit designation. He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, maintaining the proper position of attention, but he offered no verbal acknowledgement of my questions. "Soldier, I'm speaking to you," I said, using the command voice that every NCO develops after years of managing personnel. "State your name and unit." Still no response. The soldier remained motionless, staring straight ahead as if he hadn't heard me at all. By this point, the rest of the formation was getting restless. 26 soldiers were witnessing their sergeant being ignored by someone who appeared to be a junior enlisted man. and the situation was becoming awkward for everyone involved. I decided to physically get the soldier's attention. I reached out to tap him on the shoulder, a technique we used to get the attention of soldiers who might be having hearing problems or who were too nervous to respond verbally. But as my hand approached his shoulder, the soldier took a step backward, moving out of the formation with fluid precision. He then turned and walked toward the space between the two barracks buildings, moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone following specific orders. The strange thing was that none of us immediately followed him. 27 people, myself included, watched this soldier walk away without any of us thinking to pursue or question him further. It was as if his departure was somehow expected, somehow normal, even though nothing about the situation made sense. He walked approximately 30 feet toward the narrow alley between the buildings, where the overhead lighting created deep shadows during evening hours. As he moved into that shadowed area, his figure seemed to fade into the darkness in a way that struck me as unusual, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. When I realized what had happened, I immediately sent 2 soldiers to follow him and determine his identity and unit assignment. They returned 5 minutes later, reporting that they had found no trace of anyone in the area between the buildings. This seemed impossible. The space between Barracks 7 and 8 was completely enclosed, high walls on 3 sides with only one entrance, the same entrance the soldier had used. There was nowhere for someone to go without being seen, and certainly nowhere to hide. I dismissed the formation and immediately contacted the military police to report a potential security breach. While we waited for their arrival, several of us searched the entire area between the buildings, checking every door, every window, every possible hiding spot. We found nothing. No sign that anyone had been there, no indication of how someone might have left the area unseen. The MPs arrived within 15 minutes and conducted their own search, but with the same results. They took statements from everyone who had witnessed the incident, reviewed our personnel rosters, and checked with other units to determine if anyone was missing from their formations. Every soldier assigned to Fort Huachuca that evening was accounted for. No one was missing, no one was in an unauthorized location, and no one matching the description of our mystery soldier could be identified. The really disturbing part came when we reviewed the security camera footage from the courtyard. The base security office had multiple cameras covering the formation area, and the MPs pulled the recordings from 1900 to 1930 hours to see if they could identify our unknown soldier. What we saw on the recording didn't match what we had experienced. The footage showed me conducting roll call with 26 soldiers in proper formation. It showed me pausing and recounting, looking confused and speaking to empty air. It showed several soldiers glancing toward the back corner of the formation, but there was no 27th person visible in any of the camera angles. According to the security recording, I had spent several minutes talking to no one, reaching toward empty space, and then watching nothing walk away toward the buildings. But every soldier present confirmed what I had seen, a real person in proper uniform who had joined our formation and then departed in an impossible manner. The incident was filed as an unexplained security anomaly, and we were instructed not to discuss it outside official channels. The MPs suggested that the stress of deployment preparations might have caused a group hallucination. though they couldn't explain how 27 people could have shared the exact same delusion simultaneously. Life on the base returned to normal, but the incident had changed something fundamental about our unit's dynamics. During subsequent formations, several soldiers mentioned feeling like someone was standing next to them, or sensing an additional presence in our ranks. It was never as obvious as that first night, but the awareness was there, a persistent feeling that our head count wasn't quite right. 3 weeks later, Specialist Martinez, one of the soldiers who had been present during the original incident, approached me privately after evening formation. "Sergeant," he said, keeping his voice low so others couldn't hear, "I think I saw him again." Martinez explained that during that night's formation, he had caught a glimpse of someone standing just outside the normal formation area, not close enough to be counted as part of our unit, but near enough to be noticeable. When he had turned to look directly, there was no one there. "But I swear someone was watching us," he said. "Someone in uniform just outside the light." Over the following months, similar reports became commonplace. Soldiers would mention seeing peripheral movement during formations, or feeling observed during evening roll call. The incidents were never dramatic enough to warrant official investigation, but they created an atmosphere of unease that affected everyone in the unit. The most unsettling report came from Corporal Johnson, who was pulling night guard duty 6 months after the original incident. Johnson was responsible for conducting security patrols around the barracks areas between midnight and 0600 hours. Around 0300, I was walking my route between buildings 7 and 8, Johnson told me. I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I started walking again, they started again. Johnson had turned around multiple times during his patrol, but never saw anyone following him. However, he was certain that someone was there, someone who understood military movement techniques well enough to maintain proper spacing and timing. "The thing that got to me," Johnson said, "was that the footsteps sounded like military boots on concrete. Not sneakers, not civilian shoes, but proper Army-issue boots. Someone who belonged here." I completed my assignment at Fort Huachuca 8 months later and transferred to a different installation. But before I left, I made an effort to research the history of our barracks area, particularly the space between buildings 7 and 8, where our mystery soldier had disappeared. What I found in the base historical records was both fascinating and disturbing. In 1943, during World War II, Fort Huachuca had served as a training center for African American soldiers who were preparing for deployment to the Pacific Theater. Building 7 had been used as administrative headquarters for the 477th Infantry Regiment, a unit that had trained extensively at the fort before shipping out to combat operations. According to the historical records, the 477th had suffered significant casualties during their deployment, and many of the soldiers who had trained in Building 7 never returned home. But the detail that made my blood run cold was in a footnote of the regimental history. In September 1943, exactly 72 years before our incident, a soldier from the 477th had been reported missing during evening formation. Private First Class Williams had been present for roll call, but had somehow disappeared before the formation was dismissed. Despite extensive searches of the base and surrounding area, he was never found. The incident report indicated that Private Williams had been standing in the back row of the formation when he was last seen, and that several witnesses reported seeing him walk toward the area between the administrative buildings. His body was never recovered, and he was eventually listed as AWOL, though his family maintained that he would never have deserted voluntarily. I never shared this information with my unit, and I never filed a supplemental report connecting our incident to the historical records. But the correlation was too specific to ignore. The question that haunts me isn't whether we somehow encountered the spirit of Private Williams during that formation. The question is simpler and more troubling. If that soldier has been trying to rejoin his unit for over 70 years, standing formation every night and waiting for someone to call his name, how many other missing soldiers are still out there, still reporting for duty, still waiting for orders that will never come? My name is Michael, and I served with the 1st Special Forces Group for 8 years, including multiple deployments to Southeast Asia and Latin America. Special operations work takes you to places that don't exist on most maps, conducting missions that will never appear in any official record. You learn to adapt to impossible conditions, to function in environments where conventional military doctrine doesn't apply, and to trust your instincts when logic fails you. But there's one mission that still haunts my dreams, an operation that began as a routine reconnaissance patrol and ended with questions I've never been able to answer. This happened in late 2018, during a classified operation in the mountainous jungle region along the border between Myanmar and Thailand. Our team had been inserted to investigate reports of illegal weapons trafficking through remote mountain passes. Intelligence suggested that sophisticated military hardware was being moved through areas that were supposedly uninhabited and impassable. The operational zone was about as remote as you can get on Earth. Triple canopy rainforest stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, broken only by river valleys and mountain ridges that rose above the tree line. The terrain was so difficult that local populations had avoided it for generations, and even drug smugglers and human traffickers rarely attempted to use the routes we were investigating. Our team consisted of 6 operators. Myself, our team leader Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, Communications Specialist Staff Sergeant Chen, Medic Sergeant Williams, Demolitions Expert Sergeant Martinez, and our newest team member, Sergeant Thompson, who was on his first deployment with our unit. The insertion went smoothly. A nighttime helicopter dropped into a clearing about 15 kilometers from our primary objective. We were tasked with conducting surveillance on a suspected supply route for 72 hours, documenting any activity and gathering intelligence on the scope and nature of the trafficking operation. The first day was routine. We established a base camp in dense vegetation that provided natural concealment, and moved through the jungle using techniques developed over decades of unconventional warfare. The terrain was challenging but manageable, and we reached our primary observation point without incident. The target area was a river valley where satellite imagery had detected what appeared to be vehicle tracks and temporary structures. Our job was to confirm whether the route was actively being used, and to identify the nature of any trafficking activity. What we found wasn't what we expected. Hidden beneath the canopy, we discovered the remains of what appeared to be a military installation, not recent, but not ancient either. Concrete foundations overgrown with vegetation, rusted metal structures that had once been buildings, and the unmistakable layout of a forward operating base. The construction style was unfamiliar, not American, not Vietnamese, not Thai. The concrete had been poured using techniques and materials that didn't match any military engineering standards I recognized from my training or experience. Rodriguez decided to investigate. We moved through the ruins carefully, documenting everything with our cameras and taking GPS coordinates of significant structures. The place had an atmosphere that made everyone uncomfortable, not just the usual tension of operating in hostile territory, but something deeper, something that made your skin crawl even when there was no apparent threat. In what had once been the main administrative building, we found filing cabinets filled with documents written in multiple languages: English, Thai, Burmese, and others I couldn't identify. Most of the papers were too damaged by humidity and time to read completely. But Chen managed to salvage enough fragments to piece together disturbing information. The installation had been some kind of joint military operation, established in the 1970s during the height of regional conflicts. According to the documents we could decipher, it had been used for psychological warfare research and unconventional interrogation techniques. The official designation was Project Whispering Valley, and it had been classified at the highest levels of multiple governments. But the most unsettling discovery was a series of incident reports dated from the facility's final months of operation. The reports described personnel experiencing auditory hallucinations during night patrols, equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained by environmental factors, and what the commanding officer described as severe psychological deterioration among experienced personnel. The final report, dated 6 months before the facility was apparently abandoned, contained a single line that made my blood run cold. Recommend immediate evacuation. The jungle is not empty. We decided to establish our observation post in a different location, away from the ruins. Something about that place felt wrong, and Rodriguez trusted our collective instincts enough to avoid compromising the mission by remaining in an area that was affecting team morale. That night, while Thompson and I were pulling first watch, we heard something that changed everything. The jungle at night is never truly quiet. There's always the sound of insects, the movement of small animals, the rustle of vegetation in the wind. But around midnight, all of those natural sounds stopped. The silence was so complete, it was almost painful, like the pressure change you experience during a severe storm. In that unnatural quiet, we heard voices. They were distant, muffled by the dense vegetation, but clearly human. The voices seemed to be speaking in English, though the words were too indistinct to understand. What was unmistakable was the tone, urgent, authoritative, like military personnel conducting operations under stress. Thompson whispered into his radio to alert the rest of the team, and within minutes, all 6 of us were awake and listening. The voices continued for approximately 20 minutes, sometimes seeming to come from different directions, sometimes appearing to move through the jungle in a coordinated pattern. Rodriguez made the decision to investigate. We moved through the darkness using night vision equipment, following the sound of the voices while maintaining tactical formation. The terrain was treacherous in the dark, fallen logs, hidden streams, and vegetation so thick that progress was measured in yards rather than miles. After 40 minutes of careful movement, we reached a small clearing where the voices seemed to have originated. What we found defied explanation. The clearing showed clear signs of recent military activity, boot prints in the soft earth, areas where equipment had been placed, even what appeared to be defensive positions around the perimeter. But there was no one there. No evidence of how anyone might have left the area. No tracks leading away from the clearing. Most disturbing were the boot prints themselves. They were clearly military issue, consistent with the type of jungle boots used by special operations personnel. But when we compared them to our own footprints, they didn't match any of the 6 different boot sizes and tread patterns worn by our team. We searched the area for 3 hours, using every detection method available to us. Thermal imaging showed no human heat signatures. Motion sensors detected no movement larger than small animals. Even our communications equipment, which could detect electronic signatures from tactical radios, showed no indication that anyone else was operating in the area. But the evidence of recent activity was undeniable. The next morning, Chen made a discovery that added another layer of mystery to our situation. While examining the documents we had recovered from the ruins, he found a personnel roster from the original facility. The list included 6 names, with a notation that they had been assigned to extended reconnaissance operations in the jungle surrounding the base. According to the final status report, those 6 personnel had departed on a routine patrol 3 days before the facility was evacuated. They had never returned, and their fate was listed as unknown, presumed deceased. The patrol roster included their equipment manifest, the same type of tactical gear we were carrying, the same communication systems, even the same jungle boots that had left the mysterious tracks in the clearing. That night the voices returned. This time they were closer to our position, and we could make out individual words and phrases. The language was definitely English, with American accents, and the terminology was consistent with military operations, references to grid coordinates, equipment status, personnel assignments. But the content of the conversations was what made the situation truly unsettling. The voices seemed to be conducting the same type of reconnaissance mission we were on, discussing the same geographical features, even referencing some of the same landmarks we had been using for navigation. Williams, our medic, suggested that we might be experiencing some form of auditory hallucination caused by environmental factors, perhaps toxic plants, contaminated water, or atmospheric conditions unique to the region. But all 6 of us were hearing the same voices saying the same things, which made a group hallucination highly unlikely. Rodriguez decided to attempt contact. Using his tactical radio, he broadcast on standard military frequencies, identifying our unit and requesting identification from whoever was operating in our area. The response was immediate and chilling. Ghost 6, this is Recon 17. Be advised, your location is compromised. Recommend immediate extraction. The voice was clear, professional, and transmitted on a frequency that our equipment shouldn't have been able to receive. But more disturbing was the call sign. Ghost 6 was Rodriguez's operational designation for this mission. Information that was classified and known only to our team and our command structure. Chen tried to trace the transmission source using our direction-finding equipment, but the signal seemed to be coming from multiple locations simultaneously, as if the transmission was being repeated or relayed through several different radio systems. Rodriguez responded, requesting clarification and identification, but the mysterious voices had gone silent. For the rest of the night, our radios detected only static and the occasional burst of encrypted data that our equipment couldn't decode. The final incident occurred on our third day in the jungle. We were preparing to move to our extraction point when Martinez, who was conducting a final security sweep of our camp, called out for assistance. When we reached his position, he was standing at the edge of our perimeter, staring into the jungle with an expression I had never seen on his face before. "There's someone out there," he said quietly. About 50 meters northeast, behind the large mahogany tree. We all looked in the direction he was pointing, using binoculars and our rifle scopes to scan the vegetation. At first, I saw nothing but jungle, the typical maze of tree trunks, hanging vines, and filtered sunlight that characterizes triple canopy rainforest. Then Thompson grabbed my arm and pointed. "There," he whispered, "do you see it?" I followed his gaze and saw what had gotten Martinez's attention. Partially concealed behind a massive tree trunk, approximately 50 meters from our position, was the unmistakable outline of a human figure in military uniform. The figure was standing completely motionless, in a position that would have provided excellent observation of our camp. Through my rifle scope, I could see details of the uniform, the same type of jungle fatigues we were wearing, the same equipment configuration, even what appeared to be the same unit patches. But when I tried to focus on the figure's face, I couldn't make out any features. It wasn't that the face was obscured by shadows or vegetation. It was as if there simply wasn't a face there at all. Just a smooth, featureless surface where a human face should have been. Rodriguez attempted to signal the figure, using hand gestures that are standard in military operations. There was no response. He then called out verbally, identifying our unit and requesting identification from the observer. The figure remained motionless for approximately 3 minutes. Then, without any transition or movement that we could detect, it was gone. Not hidden, not moved to a different position, simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. We immediately moved to investigate the location where the figure had been standing. The ground was soft jungle soil that should have retained clear footprints, but we found no trace of human presence. No disturbed vegetation, no equipment marks, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. That's when Chen made the discovery that convinced us we needed to leave immediately. While searching the area around the tree, he found something buried in the soft earth. A military dog tag, corroded and barely readable, but with enough text visible to identify the owner. The name on the tag matched one of the personnel listed on the patrol roster from the abandoned facility. One of the 6 soldiers who had disappeared 30 years earlier during the final days of Project Whispering Valley. We extracted from the area within 6 hours, using our emergency communication protocols to request immediate helicopter pickup. The mission was classified as completed, though our official report made no mention of the voices, the mysterious radio transmissions, or the faceless figure in the jungle. But the questions that arose from that mission have never been answered. 3 months later, while reviewing satellite imagery of the region for a different operation, our intelligence analyst discovered something that added another layer of mystery to our experience. Recent photographs of the area showed what appeared to be human heat signatures in the jungle around the abandoned facility. Signatures that matched the movement patterns and equipment configurations of a 6-man special operations team. But according to operational records, no military units had been deployed to that region since our mission. The heat signatures appeared on multiple satellite passes over a period of several weeks, always in the same area, always following patrol routes that were consistent with reconnaissance operations. But when other teams were sent to investigate, they found no trace of human activity. I never returned to Southeast Asia after that deployment, and I've never discussed the details of our mission with anyone outside our team. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about those 6 soldiers who disappeared in the jungle 30 years ago. If they're still out there, still conducting their reconnaissance patrol, still trying to complete a mission that ended before they ever made it back to base. What happens when soldiers become lost not just in space, but in time itself? The question that haunts me isn't what we encountered in that jungle. The question is whether somewhere in those mountains, in that endless green maze of vegetation and shadows, there are other patrols still operating, still following orders, still trying to find their way home from wars that ended decades ago. When I first started experiencing everything I'm about to tell you, I thought I was losing my mind. I won't lie to you, I was extremely skeptical. Even today, a small part of me wonders if it was all just an elaborate hazing ritual by the senior staff to frighten us recruits. But if that's what it was, why did it go on for so long? I guess that's where the prank theory falls apart. If I'm going to tell this story properly, I need to start from the beginning. My name is Marcus, and I enlisted in the United States Army 22 years ago. Truth is, I didn't have many options. At 18, I wasn't exactly sure where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do with my life. My father was strict and gave me an ultimatum: work, go to college, or join the military. To his surprise, I chose the last option. I signed my contract and soon received orders to report to Fort Campbell in Kentucky. I remember the bus ride to the base was quiet, and the other recruits, boys and girls my age, were just as nervous as I was. The moment we arrived, a group of drill sergeants started yelling at us, completely disorienting us. Those first days were definitely the hardest, and I don't remember much from that period except being constantly on edge with someone screaming in my face. As the weeks passed, I gradually adapted to the physical training. I won't say the drill sergeants became any nicer, but at least in our barracks, we gave them fewer and fewer reasons to yell at us. We trained day and night, and after 12 weeks of grueling training, I graduated as an Army soldier. We celebrated quite a bit, but shortly after graduation, we were reassigned to AIT, Advanced Individual Training. Simply put, it was time to give us a trade in the Army and make us useful soldiers capable of helping with any task. I was assigned to the Army Engineer School, and this is where things started getting strange. I moved to another part of Fort Campbell with other soldiers who, like me, had been assigned to engineering. The school was still very strict, but at least the sergeants no longer yelled at us for breathing. Now our education focused on showing us everything essential we needed to know for military engineering. Building bridges, trenches, demolishing structures, constructing fortifications, and digging or mapping tunnels. It turns out Fort Campbell was perfect for the latter, as it sits on the edge of the Mammoth Cave region in Kentucky. The area wasn't just surrounded by seemingly endless forests. Beneath us stretched vast, enormous caverns and cave systems carved by underground rivers over millennia. Our first training exercise in one of these caves was based on our ability to navigate and map the area, identifying cave stability and access points. Fortunately, I'm not claustrophobic, but that didn't prevent it from being overwhelming to enter one of these caves for the first time, illuminated only by flashlights and with my gear on my back. There were 4 of us at that moment: Rebecca, Victor, Staff Sergeant Chen, and myself. In the distance, apart from the constant dripping of water, nothing could be heard. We walked in silence and stopped every so often at the sergeant's order to conduct stability studies on the rocks and earth around us, while Victor mapped the location. About 3 hours had passed, and I was focused on my work when a loud banging sound caught my attention. It wasn't like the sound a falling rock makes. It was more like someone forcefully striking one rock against another. My gaze and flashlight beam focused on an opening adjacent to the main path we were following, and I felt something was wrong. Staff Sergeant Chen asked me what was happening, and I told her what I had heard. She completely dismissed it and told me to continue. However, it didn't take long for me to notice I wasn't the only one disturbed by that sharp knock. Victor had also lost concentration, and Rebecca kept glancing back at that opening. Maybe we had been at that exercise for 15 or 20 minutes when again, a sharp knock echoed from inside the opening. And I would have been happy to ignore it if not for the fact that a second later, as if it had been waiting for us to ignore it, we heard a faint moan. This time I stood up again, looking for confirmation on my sergeant's face, but Chen seemed evasive. We all looked at her, and she simply told us, "Don't waste time. If you start trying to make sense of every sound in a cave, you'll go crazy." And yet, despite what she told us, and the force with which she said it, I noticed she was nervous too. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see her watching that opening, and as far as I knew, only we had entered the tunnels that night. 5 minutes later, another moan from the opening made us straighten our backs. I looked at the sergeant, and before I could speak, she said firmly, "I heard it too. Keep working." We finished in that room-like area with 2 tunnels branching off from it. The sergeant stood still for a minute before telling us we would go down the tunnel I had described. We all looked at each other nervously, and that made her extremely angry. She told us she knew these caves better than anyone, and that we would go wherever she ordered. We obeyed immediately and began descending through that narrow tunnel, continuing with the mapping task. The smell there was unpleasant, musty, and slightly sour, as if something was rotting. I thought of a rat or some decomposing animal, but despite illuminating in all directions, I saw no dead animals, and the smell kept getting stronger. Suddenly, when we were halfway through the tunnel, a sharp scream frightened us all. I had 2 stone walls between my chest and back and hit my legs hard. Rebecca said it had been a bat, but that was a lie. That had sounded human, and we had all heard it. I looked again at Staff Sergeant Chen, and this time it was impossible for her to disguise her disturbed expression. The scream had sounded very close, and she knew it. She didn't pretend again that nothing was happening, and told us in a tone that tried to be firm, but in which I noticed many doubts. Someone must be trapped in the cave. Sergeants are human too. And I knew that, like us, Staff Sergeant Chen was very nervous and confused. She tried to call the base, but we were at great depth, and the cave walls prevented us from communicating. This was a military installation, so there shouldn't be anyone trapped. But if that were the case, it would take us 3 hours to return and give notice, and while we were returning, another 3 or 4 hours would easily pass. Too much time if some curious person had snuck into the caves, and now needed help. That's why the sergeant decided to continue. Rebecca rubbed her hands nervously, and I tried to recover from the blow to my knees. At that moment, I began to remember all those horrible legends of cannibals in caves and lost tribes. My imagination began to run wild, and as we continued along the path, I wished with all my strength that I had my weapons. Obviously, we didn't have them since it was just a mapping task. Again a moan, a whisper put us on alert, and Victor, who was in front, stopped short, looking toward a small, narrow incline. The sergeant ordered him to continue, and at first he obeyed, but halfway up he let out a scream and dropped down, surprising everyone. Chen told him to climb up, impatient, but he said in a trembling tone, "I can't, Sergeant." That was serious. Nobody refuses a sergeant's order, but Victor was terrified. And when Chen asked him what he meant by "I can't, Sergeant," he told her with a broken voice, "Someone moved in there." I felt my soul leave my body. That moment was so surreal that I perceived myself as if I were inside a movie. When Staff Sergeant Chen suddenly shouted, "United States Army, is anyone there?" A brief moment of silence preceded a deep scream that extended throughout the entire cave. Victor crouched down. I looked at the sergeant, and she stared fixedly at the opening. Then she looked at me and gave me the order to climb through the opening. I don't know where I got the strength and determination to obey her, because despite being scared to death, I pushed Victor aside and climbed through the opening about 6 feet up, supporting myself on the rock walls until my torso emerged in a cave chamber. The smell of putrefaction was strong in that place, so much so that I had to cover my nose with my sleeve while illuminating everything around, trying to see someone. Rebecca followed me, and then the sergeant. We called to that person and carefully explored the chamber of about 150 feet, searching behind every nook where someone could hide. There was no exit. Victor stayed at the only one, and despite our efforts, we found no person. We heard no more screams, knocks, or moans, and only found a decomposing deer abandoned in a corner. That discovery made me feel very bad, and again my imagination took flight. When we found no one, the sergeant told us we should return to report this. However, I asked her if she knew whether mountain lions usually brought their prey so deep into caves, and she told me no. Nobody said anything more about it, and we ended the exercise at that moment, ignoring the elephant in the room. Victor saw someone. We reached the outside around 11 at night and reported everything that had happened. Or rather, Staff Sergeant Chen did, Rebecca, Victor, and I returned to our barracks. I don't know if an investigation or search was conducted in case someone had entered the caves, but the truth is that throughout my entire training as an engineer, I heard strange sounds in the caves. Sometimes they were subtle and hard to distinguish, but on very specific occasions, I heard those distant screams again and felt that unpleasant, musty, and putrid smell. Some of my companions, though not all, had also heard strange noises and perceived very strong smells inside the caves. We couldn't explain how, who, or why, but the reality is that until the last day of my training, I felt that enormous cave complex beneath Fort Campbell wasn't completely empty. If someone asked me today what I think it is, I wouldn't know what to say. I don't like to let my imagination run wild, so I doubt there's any native tribe hiding there. Sometimes, I think it's just part of the training to get us used to dealing with fear in a closed, dark place. And yet another part of me tells me there's something strange hiding in those caves, stalking and watching you from the darkness. I have a story to tell you, but before I begin, I want you to be very discreet with my identity and the country I belong to. I'm a member of a special forces unit, and due to the nature of my work, a very high level of discretion is expected from me. However remote the possibility, it doesn't suit me for it to be known that I'm going around telling horror stories on the internet. I know you'll respect this request. Thank you in advance for reading me. I know this will help me get off my chest what I saw a couple of years ago, and that unlike my companions, the members of this community will understand what I experienced. Living in such a large country with so many jungle territories and rural zones, we don't need to go to war with anyone to have constant conflicts. Crime, traffickers, guerrillas, and other armed groups threaten the peace of the territory every day. So part of our job, besides keeping them under control so they don't become an even bigger problem, is to be prepared to fight in complicated terrain. Although my squad and I had passed our training to belong to special forces, this didn't prevent us from being frequently exposed to survival exercises. In March of 2019, our superiors scheduled an extraction exercise. The idea of this exercise was to test our survival and navigation skills in solitary conditions. The chosen location was the jungle near the barracks where we were stationed, and the objective of the exercise was to travel alone through 60 kilometers of jungle until we could reach the extraction point. I know that for some it may sound impossible that they abandon someone in the middle of the jungle like that, but each of us is supposed to be prepared physically and mentally for this situation. And honestly, we are. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I felt capable of the task. The problem is that no training or military course prepared me for what I would see on the first night of my exercise. They took me by helicopter to a remote jungle area, and I rappelled down into a clearing surrounded by thick vegetation. I had all my equipment, my weapons, survival food that should last me about 3 days or more if I rationed it, water purification tablets, everything necessary for a period of survival in the jungle, plus satellite equipment to communicate with the barracks in case something happened to me and I needed an emergency extraction. I felt ready for the mission, and after analyzing my situation, I marked a route on the map and began my journey through the jungle. At this point in the story, my biggest concern was insect bites and dangerous animals. Also, the jungle is very humid, so I constantly checked my clothing, making sure it was well sealed to prevent leeches or ticks from sticking to my skin. Everything was going relatively well. The humidity and heat barely let you breathe, and getting disoriented is very easy, not to mention that the irregular terrain and mud can make an hour's march feel like 5. Night was approaching, and instead of continuing my march, I began looking for a place to make a small camp where I could spend the night. This is where the strange things started. I found a relatively clear area with 2 solid trees where I could hang my hammock. Don't think of a conventional hammock. This was military grade, more solid, with mosquito netting, strong enough to carry me and my equipment. Sleeping on the humid jungle floor is impossible. I moved about 300 feet away, lit a small stove, and heated my dinner. I was eating, sitting on a rock, when in the distance I heard a little laugh that almost made me drop my food on the ground. The jungle has many strange sounds, many birds, amphibians, and insects that emit calls that give you goosebumps. And yet that little laugh was the first up to that moment that truly managed to take me out of my usual state of tranquility. I looked suspiciously toward my campsite area. I practically swallowed the rest of my food, and in less than a minute, I ran back to the campsite with everything packed in my backpack and my rifle ready, because I didn't know what I might find. The path back to the campsite was uphill along a small trail created by animals. My hammock was hidden behind the vegetation, and you couldn't see it until you reached a bend that was about 60 feet away. A very short distance, too short to confuse me. When I reached the bend, I can swear I saw with my own 2 eyes a small girl with black hair and dark skin touching my hammock. I lowered my weapon, and in that instant it took me to blink. The little girl had disappeared. I ran to the hammock and called to her, but no one answered. I only heard her little laugh once more, a bit louder, surrounding me. It's complicated to describe the fear I felt at that moment, because although it was just a girl, the context where I found myself and that little laugh echoing throughout the place frightened me. Nothing explained a girl being in that place, and much less would she have any reason to be able to laugh in such a sinister way, as if she had merged with the forest. I had never experienced anything paranormal, but I knew in that instant that what I had just experienced wasn't something natural. I checked my map, my coordinates, and yes, in my country's jungle there are still several indigenous tribes, but no registered community was even remotely close to the area where I was. The sun was about to set, and to the already threatening atmosphere of the nocturnal jungle was added the presence of that mysterious girl who, although I couldn't see her, I could feel. She circled me like a jaguar, stepping on branches, moving leaves, and sometimes, in brief moments, laughing at me. Obviously, I didn't manage to sleep all night. I jumped out of my hammock a couple of times and tried to look for her in the darkness with a powerful flashlight. Every shadow reminded me of her. Every silhouette moving slightly was threatening. But besides small animals and insects, I couldn't see anything concrete. I thanked God with all my strength when morning came. I had breakfast, a few crackers, and a supplement drink. I took down the hammock and ran out of there hoping not to encounter anything on the way and to leave that brief episode of terror behind. My wish didn't come true. Unlike the previous day, the journey through the jungle that day was much more uncomfortable and difficult. And not because of humidity, terrain, or heat, but because of the constant sensation of being stalked. A constant and inexplicable weight on my neck made me turn in all directions, trying to locate those eyes that had me in their sights. At some point, around 10 in the morning, I was turning more out of inertia, without hope of seeing anything, when I heard a branch move a few meters behind me. And again I turned, expecting to see a bird flying in the thicket, but I didn't see it again. That little girl had a very big smile with teeth so white they could reflect me. On her face she wore red and black paint, and her hair was straight and very long. This time I could see her better because she was hanging from a branch about 40 feet away. She wore rags. I figure she couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Suddenly she let go of the branch. It was a fall of easily 10 or 12 feet. So I got very scared and ran to help her, and at the same time ask her what the hell she was doing there. But no matter how much I searched the environment looking for her, trying to see where she had gone, there was no way. Again, I heard her little laugh surrounding me, and I felt like vomiting when I realized once more that this girl wasn't normal. Just to make sure, I carefully checked the humid and muddy ground looking for small footprints. If she had been following me, I would necessarily have to see some kind of trace. Nothing. I simply found not one footprint that proved the existence of that little girl. For a moment I thought about requesting an emergency extraction, but I immediately abandoned the idea. I mean, how was I going to explain to them that I requested a rescue because a girl was harassing me? I had to keep going. I still had 30 kilometers to travel before reaching the extraction point. I stopped turning around at every sound I heard and stopped reacting when I heard her little laugh several meters behind me. I only paid attention to her again when I heard her to my right, going down a slope. My common sense told me to keep advancing along the route I had planned, but something deep inside asked me to follow that girl's little laugh. I thought about it for a long time, and in the end, I gripped my rifle tighter. Not because I thought of using it, but because somehow it gave me security to hold it. And I went down the slope, pushing vegetation aside with a machete. The path was difficult and rough, but suddenly it became easier along a very deteriorated stone path. I didn't realize what was in front of me until I was very close. A rustic stone and adobe cabin in terrible condition was in front of me, hidden among the thicket. I looked at it carefully without approaching or touching it. My heart was beating fast, and after breathing deeply, I asked aloud, "Do you live here?" I heard her voice for the first time. She was a little girl with a high-pitched, childish voice, but I didn't understand what she said. She spoke to me in an unknown language, and although I have tried to imitate it in front of people who know quite a bit about indigenous ethnicities, no one has been able to tell me what language it could be. What I am sure of is that in her little voice, I felt a bit of sadness, although she wanted to camouflage it with little laughs. I've been in real combat situations and have faced drug traffickers and guerrillas for hours. You never lose fear, but you learn to deal with it and do your job. At that moment, a similar feeling overwhelmed me. I was afraid, but I still cautiously advanced toward the entrance of that cabin. The palm roof had fallen long ago, but I could still see what appeared to be rustic wooden furniture, a kind of cupboard, and in the back, a large bed made of planks. It seemed the place had been abandoned not many years ago, as the structure remained solid. I began to investigate while listening to that girl's voice deep in the jungle. And when I checked the bed, I found the scattered remains of what I imagine were an adult and a child. That discovery devastated me, and for an instant I could feel her standing behind me. I don't understand very well how they ended up in that remote place, but you can tell something happened to them. I called my superiors to tell them what I had found. They asked for my coordinates and instructed me to wait at the location. I sat at the entrance for a long while as the hours passed, until I finally heard them call me. My superior told me to abandon the area. They wouldn't send anyone to that place. I dared to ask why, and he simply told me, "It's not in anyone's interest." That sat very badly with me, but it can happen sometimes. During all that time, I heard her moving around me, hidden in the vegetation. I could see her out of the corner of my eye, returning my gaze, and knowing that no one would come to discover what happened to her. I did the only thing that seemed right to me. I improvised a shovel with the debris from that shack and dug 2 graves. I'm not a forensic expert or anything like that, but I did my best to separate the girl's bones from those of the adult who accompanied her. Maybe it was one of her parents. And I insist, I'm not a forensic expert, but I found no wounds on the bones or bullet marks or anything obvious, so I assume they died from some disease or perhaps hunger or thirst. It saddens me a bit to remember it. Before nightfall, I was covering the graves. I didn't know the girls' religion, and I very much doubt they were Catholic. But I prayed in Our Father and left, hoping that little girl would somehow find peace. I continued on my way, and although I heard her a couple more times talking to me and laughing, I spent the next night peacefully, and at sunset on the 4th day, I managed to reach the extraction point. My companions know the details of this story, but my superiors ignore it because, well, I was very worried that they would think I was going crazy from being alone in the jungle. As for what my companions think, they say that probably stress and dehydration made me see things, and they consider it impossible that what I told them happened. However, I know what I experienced, and I know myself well. I know how to deal with pressure, and I stay calm in adverse situations. That exercise wasn't even close to pushing me to the limit enough to make me hallucinate or imagine things, right? That's why I'm sure it was real, and I hope this story serves so that girl is remembered and so that I can let her go. The only thing I hope is that girl can rest in peace, or at least that no one bothers her again. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.